War Council chamber smelled of old wood, melted candle wax, and the kind of tension that never fully leaves a room, even after the men inside it have gone. 3 candles burned low on the long oak table. Outside the thick stone walls, rain hammered the roof of the Ashvale Palace in waves, as though the sky itself had something urgent to say. Alpha King Cayden Voss stood at the head of the table, with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. He had not sat down in over an hour. Around him, 6 of his most senior council members leaned over maps, their fingers tracing border lines that had been redrawn too many times in the past 5 years. Every redrawing had cost lives. Every line on that map was paid for in blood that his people shed. Elder Dorian, the oldest member of the council and the one Cayden trusted most, pressed a wrinkled finger to the eastern edge of the map. "The Crest Pack raided 3 of our grain outposts this week," he said, his voice low and even. "Not soldiers. Families. Farmers." He paused. 2 of them did not survive. Cayden did not move. He stared at the map. "The Hollenbrook clan is moving supply lines south," said Commander Perth from across the table. He was a broad man with a scar that ran from his ear to his chin, and he spoke with the blunt efficiency of someone who had seen too many plans fall apart. "If they reach the river crossing before our patrols reset, they will cut off the southern farming villages entirely. We are talking about 40,000 people without food routes by mid-season." The rain outside grew louder. Cayden finally spoke. His voice was not raised. "It never needed to be. How many times have we reinforced those crossings?" 4 times in 18 months, Perth answered. "Each time, the Hollenbrook men pull back, wait for us to thin our numbers elsewhere, and then move again. They are not trying to win a battle. They are trying to tire us out." Cayden turned away from the table and walked toward the narrow window at the far end of the room. Below, through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the lights of the capital, scattered, warm, alive. He thought about the people behind those lights. The children, the old men who remembered the last full war and still flinched at thunder because it sounded too much like cannon fire. He had become king at 24, 3 years after his father's death, and 1 year after the border skirmishes began. He was 29 now. 5 years of grinding, creeping conflict that never became a full war, but never ended either. 5 years of watching his treasury drain, his soldiers exhaust themselves, and his people lose the particular kind of hope that keeps a kingdom standing from the inside. "There is another option," Elder Dorian said from behind him. Cayden did not turn around. "I know what you are going to say." "Then let me say it plainly, so it is on the table, and not circling overhead like a bird none of us want to name." Dorian's chair scraped as the old man rose to his feet. "The Aldrich family has no alliance with the Crest Pack or the Hollenbrook clan. They are neutral. They have been neutral for 30 years, and every faction respects that neutrality, because the Aldrich bloodline carries weight that even enemies acknowledge." He paused. "Lady Serene Aldrich is 26 years old. She is educated, calm, and by all accounts a woman of genuine character. Her father has already sent quiet signals to the Eastern Court suggesting he would look favorably on a union." Perth looked at the table. 2 younger council members exchanged a glance. Cayden finally turned around. His face gave away nothing. It rarely did. "You want me to marry her?" "We want you to consider it," Dorian said carefully. "A marriage into the Aldrich line would bring their neutrality into formal alignment with Ashvale. The Crest Pack would not risk aggression against a kingdom now connected to the Aldrich name. The Hollenbrook clan values trade routes that pass through Aldrich-controlled land. They would not bite the hand that now shares a table with us." He spread both palms open. "It is not a perfect solution, but it is a real one, and it does not cost anyone their life." Cayden looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the map, then at the candles, burning down to their ends. "Arrange the correspondence," he said. He left the room without another word. He walked the corridor alone, which was unusual. He had guards, of course, and they fell into step at a respectful distance behind him as he moved through the palace's upper halls, but he had long ago made it clear that he preferred silence when he walked at night. The guards respected this. Most people in the palace respected whatever Cayden Voss made clear, because he was the kind of man whose silence said as much as another man's shout. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that had been cut short since the day he was crowned, and had stayed that way because there was simply never time to think about it. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that changed shade depending on the light around him. In candlelight they looked almost silver. In daylight they looked the color of river water before a storm. He had a strong face, the kind that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. All angles and straight lines, and a mouth that did not smile casually. When he did smile, genuinely and without performance, the people who saw it sometimes said afterward that it caught them off guard, because it changed his whole face in an instant and made him look briefly, completely human. He was, of course, fully human, or as fully human as an alpha in his bloodline could claim to be. The wolf inside him was a constant presence, not loud or disruptive, but there, the way a heartbeat is always there. It had chosen no mate in 29 years, which was unusual. Most alphas of his rank felt at least the early pull of a bond by their mid-20s. His had remained quiet, which the elders sometimes spoke of in lowered voices, as though it were a sign of something, though no one ever said of what. He did not think much about it. He had a kingdom to hold together. That night, alone in his private study with a glass of untouched water on the desk beside him, he wrote 3 short lines to his personal secretary, instructing that initial contact be made with the Aldrich household. He sealed the letter, left it on the corner of the desk, and went to the window again. The rain had slowed to a thin, steady drizzle. The Capitol lights blurred softly through the wet glass. He thought about Serene Aldrich, whom he had never met but whose name he had heard before. Always attached to words like composed, capable, and wise beyond her years. He thought about what a marriage between strangers actually looked like from the inside. He had seen diplomatic marriages among neighboring kingdoms. Some of them were genuinely respectful arrangements. Most of them were simply 2 people doing their duty in the same rooms, while living separate interior lives. He thought he could manage that. He had managed harder things. He did not know, standing at that window in the quiet drizzle, that 40 minutes walk from where he stood, in the lower quarters of the city, a young woman was being told she no longer had a home. Her name was Elara Vane. She stood at the door of the house she had lived in for 6 years, the pack house of the Morrow Pack, a small but structured community in the working quarter of Ashvale's capital, and she listened to the pack leader, a thick-necked man named Garrett, read from a short, handwritten document in a voice that carried no particular emotion. The Morrow Pack formally removes Elara Vane from membership, he read, effective immediately, on the grounds of failed integration and absence of confirmed bond status. Her name is struck from the pack register. She is to remove her belongings by morning and is released from all shared obligations. He folded the paper when he finished. Elara stood very still. Behind Garrett, in the doorway of the pack house, 3 or 4 of her former packmates stood and watched. None of them spoke. One of them, a woman named Clara who had shared meals with Elara at the same table for 3 years, looked away and studied the ground at her feet. "You knew," Elara said. Her voice was quiet. It did not shake, which surprised her, because the rest of her was shaking on the inside in a way she could feel behind her ribs. "You knew this was coming and you did not tell me." Garrett folded his arms. "The decision was made by the pack. It is not personal. I have lived here for 6 years. And in those 6 years," he said, with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this, "you have not formed a single confirmed bond. You have not contributed to the pack's social structure in the ways our pack requires. You are an omega without anchor. Our pack cannot carry members who do not integrate." He paused. "This is not cruelty. It is how packs survive." She looked at him. She wanted to say something that would pierce through that rehearsed calm. She wanted to tell him that she had cooked for this pack when 3 members were ill at the same time and no one else stepped in. That she had stayed up through 2 full nights with old Bernard when his breathing was bad and his mate was traveling. That she had sown tears in the pack banners before the autumn festival when the seamstress was late and Garrett himself had been panicking. She did not say any of it. Because she understood, in the way that people who have been quietly dismissed their whole lives come to understand, that it would not matter. She could list every contribution she had ever made, and Garrett would nod along patiently, and at the end simply say again, "You have not bonded. You are an omega without anchor. You do not fit." She had never fit. That was the truth of her life, running through it like a current under still water, present always, visible only when the light hit a certain way. She had been born into a smaller pack in the outer regions, raised by a mother who was gentle and a father who was largely absent, and from the time she was old enough to understand what the word Omega meant in the world she lived in, she had understood that it came with a specific set of expectations and a specific set of limitations. Omegas were expected to bond. They were expected to anchor themselves to a mate or a pack structure, and in doing so become a stabilizing force. An unbonded Omega, particularly one who showed no sign of drawing a bond, was viewed with a particular kind of discomfort, as though she were a question no one wanted to answer. She had moved to Ashvale's capital 4 years after leaving her birth pack, hoping that a larger city, a larger pack, more people, more chances, might produce whatever it was she was apparently failing to produce. The Morrow pack had taken her in with cautious generosity. And now, 6 years later, that cautious generosity had run its course. She gathered her belongings in the dark. She had 2 bags, which was enough to hold most of what she owned. She moved quietly through the house, not because anyone asked her to be quiet, but because silence had become a kind of habit for her. A way of taking up as little space as possible. A way of moving through rooms without disturbing whatever was already in them. She was 23 years old. She did not cry. She had cried earlier in the season, when she had first sensed this coming. Now there was nothing left of that particular grief. What remained was something flatter and more functional, a kind of steady, practical sorrow that did not slow her down. She stepped out of the pack house with her 2 bags just before midnight, into the thin drizzle that was falling over the whole city. The streets were mostly empty. The capital lamps made gold circles on the wet cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and went quiet. She did not know where she was going. She walked. For a while she simply moved through the streets without direction, letting her feet carry her, while her mind processed the evening in small, digestible pieces. She noticed small things as she walked. A flower box on a second-floor window ledge, still holding on to the last of the season's blooms. A cat watching her from a doorstep with great calm. The sound of someone laughing inside a lit building 2 streets over, warm and entirely unaware of the drizzle, or the woman walking past in it. By the time she reached the edge of the artisan quarter, she had made a decision. It was not a grand decision. It was the only decision available to her. She would find work. She was a skilled seamstress, better than most who called themselves that, and she knew it, even if she rarely said so. She had learned the craft from her mother, and refined it through years of quiet practice. She could sew things that other people's fingers could not manage. Fine work, detailed work, the kind that required patience and steadiness. In the morning, she would find a notice board. She would look for work. She would find somewhere small and affordable to sleep, and she would start again. This was, she supposed, a skill she had also refined over the years. The skill of starting again. She did not know that there was a notice posted on the board outside the Royal Seamstress Guild, placed just that week, requesting additional skilled seamstresses to assist with preparations for an upcoming royal wedding. She did not know that the wages being offered were the highest of any guild posting in the city that season. She did not know that the work would take place inside the palace walls. She did not know any of that yet. She found a small traveler's shelter near the artisan quarter, a simple place that charged by the night and asked no questions, and she paid for 2 nights with the small amount of coin she had saved, because 2 nights was enough to find work, and she had learned not to pay for more than she could see clearly in front of her. She set her bags down on a narrow cot, took off her damp outer coat, and sat in the quiet of the small room with her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the drizzle continued. In the palace on the hill above the city, Caden Voss sat at his desk, the sealed letter in the corner, and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. His wolf was restless in a way it had no obvious reason to be. He put it down to the stress of the evening's council meeting. He poured himself a small drink, then did not touch it. Then he went to bed, because there was a full schedule the next morning, and whatever unnameable restlessness was moving through him, it would have to wait. Neither of them slept well that night. Neither of them knew why. The drizzle turned to silence just before dawn. The city of Ashvale lay still between the last of the dark and the first gray edge of morning, the kind of stillness that sits at the exact point where one chapter ends and another begins, whether the people inside it are ready or not. They were not ready. But then, they never are. The notice board outside the Seamstress Guild was crowded with postings by the time Ilara reached it the following morning. She had woken before sunrise, washed her face in cold water, eaten half a roll she had bought from a street vendor, and walked quickly through the still waking streets because she could not afford to be slow. Every morning that passed without work was a morning that cost her coin she did not have enough of. She read through the postings with careful attention. Her eyes moved from one to the next, mentally sorting them by pay, by distance, by the type of work required. Most of them were ordinary: tailoring shops looking for alterations help, small dressmakers needing hands for volume orders, a uniform supplier seeking someone who could sew quickly and did not mind repetitive stitching. Then she reached the bottom corner of the board, where a clean white card had been pinned with a single brass tack. She read it twice. The royal household was seeking experienced seamstresses to assist with preparation of formal garments for an upcoming royal ceremony. The wages listed were more than double what any other posting offered. The work was to take place in the lower service quarters of Ashvale Palace. Applicants were to present themselves at the palace's east staff entrance before midday on the day of the posting, which was, she checked the date stamped at the bottom, yesterday. She looked at it for a moment. Then she straightened, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the palace. The east staff entrance was on the far side of the palace's outer wall, a plain wooden door set into gray stone that looked, from the outside, nothing like what it led into. A young man sat on a stool beside it, with a clipboard on his knees, looking profoundly bored. He was short and neat, with fair hair, and the slightly harassed expression of someone who had already been told too many things that morning. Ilara approached him. "I am here about the seamstress posting," she said. The young man looked up from his clipboard. "Posting closed yesterday midday," he said, with the automatic tone of someone repeating a line for the fourth or fifth time. "I know," she said. "I am asking if the position is filled." He blinked. "That is, well, we had 12 applicants yesterday." "And were all 12 positions filled?" He hesitated, then looked down at his clipboard. "We needed 8. We confirmed 6. He looked up again, and something in his face shifted slightly. She was not what he had expected, perhaps. She was calm in a way that was distinct from ordinary calm, the kind of calm that comes not from ease but from having navigated difficulty enough times that panic has simply become impractical. "We are short too." "Then let me show you my work," she said, and she opened her bag. She had brought 3 samples, small pieces she had made over the past 2 years, carried in a flat cloth folder that had kept them pressed and clean through all her moving. She laid them on the edge of his clipboard without being asked. A panel of fine button work, each buttonhole perfectly spaced and finished. A collar piece, worked in a technique called flat roll, that most seamstresses avoided because it required near-perfect tension in both hands throughout. A length of gathered silk trim, every pleat identical, in depth and width. The young man, whose name was Oliver, and who had managed the palace's lower staff intake for 3 years, looked at the work. He turned the collar piece over in his hands. He held the gathered trim up to the light. He wrote something on his clipboard. "Be here at 7 in the morning," he said. "Use this entrance. Ask for me, Oliver. Bring your own scissors." She took her samples back, folded them into their cloth folder, and put them away. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without making it dramatic. She walked back toward the traveler's shelter, and she allowed herself, for approximately 1 full minute, to feel the particular relief of a person who had been standing at the edge of something and has just found the smallest possible foothold. Then she put it away, and started thinking about what she would need, and what she would not spend money on until her first wages came in. She did not allow herself to think about the palace itself, about what it would mean to work inside those walls, about the fact that the posting had said royal ceremony, and the city had been talking, in the way that cities always talk, about the announcement that had come down that same week from the palace, that King Caden Voss was to be married. She did not think about any of that. It had nothing to do with her. She was going to sew garments, that was all. The formal engagement announcement had, in fact, reached every part of the city by noon the day before. Street vendors discussed it. Shopkeepers spoke about it over counters. Children repeated it without fully understanding what it meant. The Alpha King, who had ruled without a queen for 5 years, was to marry Lady Serene Aldrich of the neutral Aldrich bloodline. The ceremony would take place within 6 weeks. The kingdom would hold 3 days of public celebration. For most people in Ashvale, this was good news. Not because they had strong feelings about the king's personal life, but because they were tired. Tired of the grinding tension at the borders. Tired of the careful way they had learned to shop and plan and hope. Never too far ahead, never too comfortably. A political marriage of this kind meant something real to them. It meant that the people in power were trying something new. It meant, possibly, that the weight might lift a little. Serene Aldrich arrived in Ashvale 4 days after the announcement, with a small and composed traveling party that attracted considerably less spectacle than the arrival of a future queen might suggest. She had specifically requested it that way. She was the kind of person who valued function over display, and she had communicated this preference so clearly and so early in the correspondence that the palace had simply accommodated it. She was a woman of moderate height, with light brown hair, sharp gray eyes, and a manner of moving through rooms that somehow gave the impression of taking up exactly the right amount of space. No more, no less. She dressed well, but not elaborately. She spoke precisely. She noticed things quickly, and said what she had noticed when it was useful, and kept it to herself when it was not. The first formal meeting between Serene and Caden took place in the palace's reception hall, in the presence of Elder Dorian and 2 members of Serene's traveling household. It lasted 45 minutes. They spoke about the treaty framework, about the practical expectations of the arrangement, about the schedule for the coming weeks. They were polite. They were direct. There was no pretense between them of something that was not there. At the end of the meeting, when the advisors had briefly stepped away to confer, Serene looked at Caden across the table and said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." "Please," he said. "I am not here under any illusion about what this is," she said. "I have agreed to it, because I believe it serves a genuine purpose, and because I have spoken at length with my father and my own advisors, and I believe you are a man of integrity. Not because I expect this to become something it was not designed to be." She paused. "I say this not to be cold. I say it because I think the clearest foundation for what we are about to do is honesty." Caden looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I appreciate that more than you know." "Good," she said, and there was something that might have been the beginning of a very small smile at the corner of her mouth. "Then I think we will manage." They were, Caden thought, as the advisors returned to the room, probably going to be all right. Not in the way people imagine, when they speak of kings and queens with their stories of sweeping love and great passion, but in the way that 2 capable, principled people can sometimes build something solid between them, if they both agree from the start to be honest with each other. He thought he could do that. He was willing to do that. He did not know, at that particular moment, that the restlessness in his wolf had sharpened that morning, without any obvious cause, in the same hour that a young woman with 2 bags had arrived at the east staff entrance of his palace, and asked Oliver whether any positions were still available. His wolf had no way of telling him, and he had no reason to pay attention. The lower service quarters of Ashvale Palace were a world that most visitors to the upper halls never thought about. They were a series of connected workrooms, storerooms, laundry halls, and narrow corridors that kept the palace functioning, the hidden circulatory system of a building that, from the outside, looked self-sustaining and grand, but was in fact dependent entirely on the quiet, constant effort of the people who worked inside it. Elara arrived at the east entrance at 10 minutes to 7 on her first morning, which was a Monday, 5 weeks before the wedding. Oliver was already there with his clipboard, looking marginally less bored than he had the previous day, and he waved her through with a brief nod and handed her a folded piece of paper with the workroom location and a brief list of current tasks. The seamstress workroom was on the 2nd underground level. Not a basement in the damp, dark sense, but a well-lit, high-ceilinged space with long wooden work tables, several good oil lamps, and a south-facing window grate at ceiling height that let in a genuine strip of daylight. 6 women were already at the tables when Elara arrived. They looked up when she entered. She nodded to the group, found an empty stool at the far end of the 2nd table, and set her bag down and took out her scissors. The woman beside her was small and quick-looking, with dark red hair braided back and a way of talking that ran slightly faster than most people's. Her name was Nell, and she had worked palace contracts for 4 years, and knew the building and its rhythms the way a sailor knows a particular stretch of coast, not by maps, but by feel. "First time in the palace?" Nell asked, threading a needle without looking at it. "Yes," Elara said. "It is very large," Nell said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone offering a genuinely useful piece of information. "Do not go up any staircase that does not have a brown rail. The ones with brown rails are service stairs. The ones without them lead to upper floors, and if you are not cleared for them, The guards will simply escort you back down, and Oliver gets a note, and it causes everyone an unnecessary amount of inconvenience. She paused. Also, the canteen opens at 11:30, not noon. Everyone goes at noon, because they think it opens at noon, so at noon, there is a queue. Go at 11:30, and it is empty. Elara looked at her. Thank you, she said, and she meant this too. The work itself was exactly what she was good at. The royal wedding garments were being prepared in stages, the structural pieces by the senior seamstresses upstairs, the finishing and trim work distributed to the lower workroom. Elara's first assignment was a long length of silver trim work for what would eventually form part of the formal tablecloth settings in the wedding hall. Fine, careful work. The kind that required her full attention. She gave it her full attention. The first morning passed in near silence, broken only by the sound of needles, scissors, and Nell's occasional quiet commentary on the palace and its occupants, which was delivered as a kind of efficient briefing between bouts of concentrated stitching. The king is in meetings most of the day, Nell said at one point, as though Elara had asked. She had not. His schedule is very tight this week because of the treaty paperwork. Lady Serene's people are on the 3rd floor, East Wing, which is near the library. She came down to the canteen herself on the 2nd day, which no one expected. She just stood in the queue like everyone else. Oliver nearly lost his clipboard. Elara concentrated on her trim work. She seems decent, Nell continued, in the tone of a careful verdict. Not showy. Doesn't make people feel small. That is, in my experience, actually the most important thing. At 11:20, Nell set down her work and stood up. Canteen, she said simply, and looked at Elara. Elara set down her scissors. They walked through the service corridor together, and Nell took her the right way, along the brown-railed stairs, talking the whole time. The canteen was warm and almost empty when they arrived. They collected food, plain but decent, filling, and sat at a corner table by a narrow window. Elara ate quietly and let Nell talk, and found that she did not mind. Nell's commentary was generous in a particular way. It gave information freely, without wanting anything back for it. It was the behavior of someone who had once been new somewhere and remembered what it was like. After a while, Nell asked, "Where were you before this?" Elara considered the question. "Various places," she said. Nell nodded, as though this were a complete answer. She did not push. She simply moved on to something else, and Elara found herself quietly grateful for this, in the way she was quietly grateful for most small kindnesses, deeply, privately, and without entirely knowing how to say so. That afternoon, the work continued. Outside the workroom, the palace moved around them, as it always did. Meetings and formal walks and correspondence, and the 100 invisible preparations that precede a major state event. On the 3rd floor, East Wing, Serene sat with her own advisors and worked through the framework document, point by point, her handwriting precise and her questions exact. On the upper floor, Caden worked through a stack of border reports that Commander Perth had submitted and tried to focus on the numbers in front of him. His wolf had gone quiet today, which was either a good sign or not a sign at all. In the basement workroom, Elara finished the first length of trim, set it aside for inspection, and picked up the next assignment without being asked. She did not know the man upstairs. She did not expect to. In her experience, people who lived in separate worlds generally stayed in them, because the world was arranged to keep that from changing. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The 5 weeks before the wedding moved with the particular speed of any period that is full of work and purpose. Elara fell into a rhythm she had not had in years. She arrived early, worked steadily, ate lunch with Nell in the mercifully quiet early canteen, and went back to the traveler's shelter at night tired, in a way that felt earned. By the end of the 2nd week, she had found a small rented room in a house 3 streets from the palace, owned by a quiet older woman named Mrs. Fallon, who asked no questions and made very good tea. She paid her first month's rent with her first wages, and felt the specific, private satisfaction of a person who has assembled a floor beneath their feet, out of nothing but their own effort. She did not think about the pack that had cast her out. She thought about it less with every day that passed, which was both a relief and a mild mystery to her. She had expected it to hurt more persistently than it did. But perhaps, she thought, it is difficult to miss something that never fully accepted you. On the evening of the day the engagement was formally proclaimed from the palace gates to a gathered crowd below, Ilara stood at the window of her rented room and listened to the distant sound of the crowd's response, a wave of sound that rose and fell and rose again. She could not see the palace from her window, she could only hear it. She thought about what it would feel like to be the center of that sound, to be the reason for it. She could not quite imagine it. Then she turned away from the window, sat down at the small table, and spent the last hour before bed mending her second-best work coat because one of the elbows had gone thin, and she could not afford to let it get worse. Outside, the city celebrated. She mended her coat. Neither of these things was more real than the other. The wedding was now 2 weeks away. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of clear, cold light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. Ilara had been at the palace since 5 in the morning, called in 2 hours earlier than usual, along with the rest of the lower workroom staff, because the morning had produced a crisis of the specific kind that royal events seem almost designed to generate. The head seamstress on the floor above had discovered, at 4:45 in the morning, that 3 lengths of formal trim on the processional banners had been stitched with the wrong tension, and were pulling visibly when hung. She needed them corrected before 8. Ilara corrected them. She sat in the upper workroom under bright lamplight, one of the few times she had been permitted above the service level, and worked with the precise, unhurried speed that she had always been able to find when the work required it. The other 2 women brought in for emergency duty worked on the outer pieces. Ilara took the center length, the most visible one, the one that would hang directly above the entrance to the main hall during the ceremony, and she reworked every 3rd stitch for its full 16-foot length. She finished at 7:40. The head seamstress, a tall woman named Mrs. Hartwell who had been managing royal ceremonial needlework for 19 years, and whose default expression was one of barely contained alarm, inspected the piece, turned it over, inspected the reverse, and said, "Good." This was, Ilara had been told by Nell, the highest praise Mrs. Hartwell distributed. She went back downstairs. The lower workroom was empty. Most of the morning's work there had been completed the previous day. She sat at her table and waited to see if there were further tasks. There were not. At 9:30, Oliver appeared at the workroom door with a different clipboard and said that all service staff not actively required for the ceremony itself were to be given a half-day and could use the staff gallery in the east corridor to observe the processional if they wished, as a courtesy from the palace. The staff gallery was a long, narrow balcony set into the interior wall of the Great Hall, about 30 feet above the floor, accessible from a service stair and separated from the hall proper by a carved wooden screen, with gaps in it wide enough to see through clearly. It had been used for exactly this purpose for centuries, a discreet vantage point from which the people who kept the palace running could, on significant occasions, watch what they had helped to build. Ilara went because Nell went, and Nell had decided with a good deal of enthusiasm that they were going, and it was simply easier to agree. They arrived early enough to get a place near the front of the screen, where the view was unobstructed. Below, the great hall was being finished by a small team of stewards, the last flowers placed, the last chairs straightened, the processional carpet smoothed. The hall itself was extraordinary. Ilara had seen pieces of it from the service passages that ran behind some of its interior walls, but she had never seen it whole and open like this. It was the size of a small field, ceilinged with stone arches, that lifted the eye upward with the practiced ease of something that had been designed specifically to make people feel small, without making them feel unwelcome. The light came through tall windows on the south wall, and landed across everything in long gold bars. The trim she had corrected that morning was hanging above the entrance archway. From here it looked perfect. She allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction about this. The guests arrived first, filling the rows of chairs in a slow, formal procession of silk and wool, and carefully arranged faces. Then the musicians in the upper gallery began, string instruments, playing something low and steady that filled the space without crowding it. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the ceremony began. Serene came first, as was the custom in Ashvale for this type of formal union, the incoming party entering the hall ahead of the presiding ruler, who would already be at the front. She walked with her father, a gray-haired man of considerable dignity, and her pace was unhurried. She wore a deep blue gown of a shade that Ilara recognized as sea blue, the formal color of the Aldrich family, and she held herself with the ease of someone who had prepared carefully for this, and had nothing left to second-guess. Around her neck was a single chain with a small round pendant. Her hair was pinned in a style that was formal without being excessive. From the gallery, Nell whispered, "She looks composed." "She is composed," Alara said quietly. And she was. You could see it from 30 feet above, and through a carved wooden screen. The quality of Serene's composure was not performed, was not the stiff stillness of someone gripping themselves tight to avoid showing anything. It was genuine. It was the composure of a person who had looked at their situation clearly and made their peace with it. Alara watched her and felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite envy, but lived in the general neighborhood of both. Then Caden Voss came to the front of the hall, and Alara saw the king for the first time. She had known he was there, of course. He had been in the palace for every one of the 5 weeks she had worked there, but the palace was very large, and the lower service quarters were very separate from the upper floors, and she had never once been in his proximity. She had seen his name on work orders. She had heard people speak of him, the way palace staff speak of the person at the center of everything, with a mixture of practicality and cautious respect. She had built, without particularly meaning to, a vague mental picture of a formal and distant figure. He did not look like a vague mental picture. He was in formal dress, deep gray, with the Ashvale crest worked into the shoulder, and he stood at the head of the hall with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the particular kind of stillness that Alara had only ever seen in people who are fully accustomed to being the object of every eye in a room, and have long since stopped responding to it. He was looking toward the door where Serene was entering. His expression was respectful and attentive. She could not see his eyes clearly from the gallery, but she could see the line of his jaw, and the set of his shoulders, and the way he stood, and there was something about all of it that pressed on her chest in a way she could not immediately explain. She put it down to the grandeur of the occasion and looked away. The ceremony lasted 45 minutes. It was formal, dignified, and conducted with efficiency. The vows were the traditional Ashvale forms, questions asked by Elder Dorian, answers given clearly by both parties, a formal exchange of plain bands that were the Ashvale symbol of treaty union. There were no extravagant declarations, there was no weeping. When it was finished, Caden and Serene stood side by side and received the approval of the assembled council with the identical composed expressions they had both worn for the entire ceremony. The hall responded with formal applause, which then rose into something warmer as it spread. From the gallery, Nell clapped, Alara clapped, the other staff around them clapped, and then people began moving, and the formal part of the morning was over. The banquet that evening was in the great dining hall, which connected to the main hall through a series of arched corridors. Service staff were not part of the banquet. Their half-day had ended at noon, and most of them had returned to regular duties or gone home. Alara had returned to the lower workroom to put away the last of the morning's materials and collect her coat. She was moving through one of the service corridors on the east side of the palace, heading toward the staff exit, when it happened. The corridor had 2 branches, a left fork that went to the canteen, and a right that connected to the east gallery passage. She was taking the right, which was the more direct route to the exit. The corridor was quiet. The banquet was already underway on the other side of the building, and the service staff had largely cleared out. She came around a corner, carrying her bag on one shoulder, and a flat roll of leftover fabric that Mrs. Hartwell had asked her to return to the lower store. He came around the same corner from the opposite direction. She had half a second of no information, just the sudden presence of another person, large and moving with purpose, and then there was no time. Her bag swung wide on her shoulder, her fabric roll went in the opposite direction, and her footing on the flagstone shifted. She caught herself against the wall with one hand, and the fabric roll hit the floor and unrolled itself down the corridor with a soft, expensive sound. "I am sorry," she said immediately, before she had even fully regained her footing, because this was her instinct in any collision, to absorb the fault before anyone could assign it. She was bent toward the fabric on the floor, reaching for it, when something happened that she would spend a very long time afterward trying to describe to herself accurately, and failing. She became aware of him. Not in the way that you become aware of any person near you, the ordinary, social awareness of another presence in a space. This was something different, something that ran from the back of her neck, down the length of her spine, and arrived in her chest, as a sensation she had no correct word for, warm and electric and wrong and right at the same time, like a note of music played at a frequency she had never heard before but her body recognized. She straightened and looked up. He was looking at her. Not with the passing look of someone who has nearly collided with a staff member in a corridor and is about to walk on. He was standing completely still, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read clearly. Not because it was blank, but because it was too many things at once, moving across his face too fast for her to name. His eyes were gray. She saw that. She saw that clearly. She did not know what was in her own face. She only knew that she could not look away for a moment that was probably 3 seconds long and felt like considerably more. Then she dropped her gaze and bent quickly to retrieve the fabric, gathering it up fast and inelegant from the floor. "I was not looking where I was going," she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "I apologize." He did not say anything immediately. She straightened with the fabric in her arms and kept her eyes low, as she had learned to do in rooms where she was the smallest name present, and she took a step to move past him. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, measured and quiet, without any particular performance in it. She stopped. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She moved past him without looking back up. She walked to the end of the corridor and turned toward the east exit and kept walking. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps moving on. No sound of him continuing in the other direction. She did not turn around. She went out through the east door and into the evening. The city outside was lit up more warmly than usual. Several of the main streets had lanterns strung for the wedding celebrations, and somewhere not far off there was music, live and cheerful and bouncing off the stone buildings. The sky above the city was a deep, clear blue, just light enough to see by, with the first stars beginning. She walked away from the palace with the fabric roll under her arm, and did not slow down until she turned onto the street where Mrs. Fallon's house was, at which point she stopped on the pavement and stood for a moment and breathed. The thing in her chest was still there, quieter now, but present, a kind of resonance, like the feeling inside a room after a bell has been struck and the sound has faded but the air still remembers it. She did not know what it was. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was the strangeness of the day, the ceremony she had watched, the grandeur of the hall and the lights and the music, and the collision in the corridor which had startled her. She told herself all of this and went inside. Caden Voss did not continue down the corridor immediately after she left. He stood for a moment in the place where the collision had happened, and his wolf, which had been quiet all day, through the ceremony and the formal reception and every deliberate, necessary performance of the afternoon, had snapped awake in a single second and was now precisely, absolutely alert in a way it had never been before. Not restless, not vaguely uncomfortable. Alert, focused, pointed in a direction. He stood there, and he breathed, and he tried to process what had just happened through the filters of logic that he had spent his entire adult life building and maintaining. It was nothing. It was a collision in a corridor. She was a staff member. He had been in a building full of people all day. He was tired. It was the end of an extraordinarily demanding day that had involved the public alteration of his entire life's trajectory. That was all. He walked back toward the banquet hall. But for the rest of that evening, through the courses and the toasts and the polite conversation and the careful public performance of a newly married king, a part of his attention remained behind, at the corner of a corridor in the east wing, in the 3 seconds he had stood looking at a woman he did not know and could not stop thinking about. He did not tell anyone. He barely told himself. He sat across from Serene at the high table, and she made a quiet observation about the head of the northern delegation that made him briefly smile, and he was grateful for it. But it did not quiet the thing in his chest. Nothing did. He did not go directly up when he left the corridor. Instead, he walked the long way back, through the lower east passage, past the kitchens, past the back entrance to the formal dining hall, where the banquet was still in full swing on the other side of the wall. He could hear it through the stone, voices, a low wave of sound, the particular register of a formal occasion that has moved past its ceremonial portion and into the part where people eat and speak freely, within the constraint of what the evening allows. He paused at a junction in the corridor and stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the wall, and simply let himself feel what he was feeling, rather than organizing it immediately into something manageable. This was not something he did often. He was very good at organizing, and very practiced at moving quickly from feeling into function. It was a skill that had served him well for 5 years of being a king, in a kingdom that could not afford the luxury of an uncertain ruler. But standing in the corridor at the bottom of his own palace on his wedding night, with the sound of the banquet overhead, and the direction in his wolf not wavering even slightly, he let himself simply be in it for a moment. It was enormous. That was the honest word for it. Whatever this was, whatever his wolf had found in 3 seconds in a service corridor with a staff member he did not know, it was enormous in the way that things are when they have been absent your entire life, and then arrive without warning. He had spent 29 years without this, without the pull, without the direction, without the particular sharp certainty that cuts through everything else, like a note played at the right frequency in a room full of noise. He had thought, in the quiet and private way that people think about things they have partly stopped expecting, that perhaps this was simply not something that was going to happen for him, that the wolf he carried was simply a quieter one, with a different relationship to the bond than most alphas he knew. He had been wrong about that. Entirely and completely wrong. He started walking again, past the kitchens, up the service stair, back to the upper levels where the guards straightened almost imperceptibly when he appeared, and Perth, who had been waiting near the banquet entrance, fell into step beside him. "Everything settled?" Perth said, which was his way of asking without asking. "Yes," Caden said, which was his way of answering without answering. Perth did not push. He had been beside Caden for 5 years, and he knew when the king was carrying something, and when it was his business to ask about it, and when it was emphatically not. He simply walked alongside him, steady and present, the way good people do when they understand that sometimes presence is its own kind of service. Caden went back into the banquet, and sat at the high table, and spoke to the necessary people, and raised the necessary glass, and did everything the evening required of him. And the direction in his chest did not leave, not even slightly. 3 days after the wedding, Caden could not sleep. This was not new, exactly. Sleep had never come easily to him. Since his early 20s, he had managed on 6 hours when he was lucky, and 4 when he was not. And he had built his days around this fact, the way a builder works around load-bearing walls, not trying to remove them, just designing everything else to account for them. But this was different from his ordinary sleeplessness. His ordinary sleeplessness was a tired mind running through tomorrow's problems, a body that simply had not yet learned how to stop. This was something else entirely. He woke at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night after the wedding, and lay in the dark of his private chamber, and understood, with the honest clarity that the very small hours of the morning sometimes produce, that he had been restless since the collision in the East Corridor. He did not want to examine this too closely. He examined it anyway, because that was what he did with everything. The restlessness had a direction. That was the part that bothered him most. It was not the generalized, unfocused pull of anxiety or fatigue or stress. It was oriented. His wolf, when he sat quietly and paid attention to it, was pulling in a direction, downward, east, as though something in the lower floors of the building had a gravity that operated specifically on him. He sat up in bed. This was not something he had read about. He had received an education in the biology and history of alpha bonding, as all ruling alphas did, but it had been the kind of education that treats its subject with the careful, dry detachment of something one is expected to understand academically, rather than experience personally. Bond recognition between a true mated pair was supposed to be immediate and mutual and unmistakable. It was supposed to announce itself. Songs were written about it, in the saccharine tradition of people who enjoy turning complicated things into simple ones. Nobody had mentioned that it might happen in a 3-second collision in an East Wing service corridor, with a woman you did not know, on the day of your wedding to someone else. He got up, and dressed in the dark, and walked. He did not have a destination in mind. He told his night guard simply that he was walking the palace, and not to follow closely. This was not unusual for him. He had always thought better in motion, and the guard knew it, and fell back to a respectful distance. He walked the upper halls first, then the middle floors. Then, without making a decision about it, he took the service stair to the lower level. The lower workrooms were empty and dark at this hour, which he had known they would be. He walked past them anyway, slowly, hands behind his back, looking at nothing in particular. The smell of the place was different from the upper floors, less formal, more functional. wood shavings and fabric sizing, and the faint lingering warmth of bodies that had been working in close quarters all day. He stopped outside the seamstress workroom. The door was closed. He did not open it. He stood there for a moment, alone in the corridor, and tried to be reasonable with himself. He was the king. He was 3 days into his marriage. He had a treaty to finalize, a kingdom to stabilize, a border situation that demanded his full and consistent attention. Whatever this was, this pull, this direction, this thing his wolf was doing that it had never done before in 29 years, it was not something he had the freedom to simply follow like a compass needle. He turned and walked back to the upper floors. But the direction was still there. It was still there when he finally lay back down in the dark. It was still there when he woke in the morning. It was still there, through all the days that followed. His beta, Rion, noticed something was wrong by the end of the first week. Rion was 40 years old, dark-skinned and broad-shouldered, with a way of speaking that was always several words shorter than what he was actually thinking. He had served as Caden's beta since Caden's coronation, and in those 5 years, he had learned to read the king with the precision of a man who has staked his professional judgment on the ability to do so accurately. He noticed the sleep deprivation in the fine lines around Caden's eyes. He noticed the way Caden's attention sometimes went somewhere else mid-sentence during council meetings, and then returned quickly, fully, as though nothing had happened. He noticed the subtle change in the king's wolf, not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but there, a low altered frequency in the way Caden carried himself, like a compass needle that has drifted a few degrees from its marked north. On a Thursday evening, after a council session that had run 2 hours long and covered the finalization of the treaty terms, Rion fell into step beside Caden in the corridor outside the meeting room and said, without preamble, "What is wrong with you?" Caden glanced at him. The Hollenbrook response to Clause 7 is still evasive. They are stalling on the supply route terms. "Not the treaty," Rion said. "You." Caden was quiet for a few steps. Then he said, "My wolf is behaving unusually." Another 3 steps of silence. Rion was very good at silence. He used it the way some people use questions. "Since the wedding," Caden said. Rion looked straight ahead. "Since the wedding," he repeated, without inflection. "I am not going to say more than that right now," Caden said. "All right," Rion said. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence. At the end of it, as they parted ways, Rion said, very quietly, "Tell me when you are ready to say more. I will not do anything with it." Caden nodded once and went to his study. He sat at his desk, without turning on the lamp, and allowed himself a few minutes of honest internal examination. The direction was still east, still downward, still there. He pulled out the palace staff roster, a document he had no ordinary reason to consult, and which was normally handled entirely by his administrative secretary, and he looked at it for a while. He was not looking for a name. He did not know a name. He was looking at the list of recent hires in the lower service departments, and he found, on the second page, a short list of 6 seamstresses brought in for the wedding preparations, 2 of which had been engaged after the original posting date. One of them was a woman from the outer city, hired on a day-of basis by the intake coordinator. A note in Oliver's handwriting beside her name said, "Exceptional sample work, recommend for future contracts." Her name was Alara Vane. He put the roster away. He did not ask about her. He did not summon her. He did not do anything at all with the name, except that it was now inside his head, where it had not been before, and it stayed there the way things do when your mind has quietly decided that they matter. Alara, in the 2 weeks following the wedding, was doing what she had always done, when life was stable enough to allow it. She was working, and she was being careful, and she was keeping her interior life pressed down below a level where it would complicate things. The wedding contract had not ended her work at the palace. Mrs. Hartwell had extended the lower workroom engagement for another 6 weeks to handle post-ceremony textile work, banners to be cleaned and refolded and stored, formal table linens to be repaired, a series of chamber curtains in the east wing that needed to be re-hemmed before the first state visit of the new partnership arrived. There was enough work for all 8 of the extended seamstresses, and the wages continued, and Alara had no intention of doing anything other than showing up every morning and working steadily and taking her wages home. The thing in her chest had not gone away. She had given it a great deal of rational attention over the past 2 weeks, and she had made very little progress toward dismissing it. It was not painful exactly. It was not disruptive in any way that showed on the outside. But it was present. A low warmth behind her ribs that did not correspond to anything she could point to and name. She was warm when there was no particular reason to be warm. She was occasionally, briefly, aware of a direction, upward, toward the upper floors, in a way that was not quite a pull and not quite a thought, more like a leaning, the way a plant will sometimes grow toward a window without any of its leaves being obviously pointed toward the light. She did not talk about this. She was not in the habit of talking about her interior experiences with anyone, partly because she had never had the kind of relationships where that was welcome, and partly because she had, over the years, developed a very functional ability to simply note something and set it aside if acting on it was not possible or wise. She noted it. She set it aside. She returned to the curtains. Nell, who was perceptive in the specific way that people who watch everything are perceptive, said to her one afternoon over lunch, "You seem like you are thinking about something you are not going to tell me about." "I am usually thinking about something," Elara said. "This is different," Nell said, with cheerful certainty. "You have that look, like something has snagged the edge of your mind, and you keep almost turning around to look at it." Elara put down her fork. "Do you know anything about what it looks like when an Omega's bond sense activates?" Nell blinked. This was clearly not what she had been expecting. To her credit, she recovered quickly. "Not from personal experience," she said carefully. "But I know the general principle. Are you asking because—" "I am asking theoretically," Elara said, and picked her fork back up. Nell was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough, that it was itself a kind of statement. Then she said, equally carefully, "Theoretically speaking, the general principle is that if a bond sense activates, it activates toward a specific person. It does not generate in the abstract. It has a source." She paused. "Theoretically." Elara nodded, and ate. "And theoretically," Nell continued, "the other half of it feels the same thing." Elara did not respond. "All right," Nell said, returning to her own lunch with the expression of someone who has made a note to revisit this conversation at a strategically better moment. It was on a Monday of the third week after the wedding that the thing between them began to become impossible to ignore, not for any dramatic reason, but because the palace is not, in the end, as large as it seems from the outside. People who live or work within it long enough will inevitably begin to occupy the same spaces. Caden had started, in those 3 weeks, to find reasons to walk certain parts of the palace that he had not previously walked on a regular basis. He was honest enough with himself to admit that these were not entirely accidental routes. He told himself he was inspecting the restoration work being done on the lower east corridor walls, which was true, as far as it went. The restoration was real. His interest in it was not. He was crossing the lower hall on his way back from one of these inspections when he heard a voice through the open seamstress workroom door that he recognized without being able to explain how he recognized it, since he had only heard it say 2 short sentences in a moment of near darkness in a corridor 3 weeks ago. He stopped. Through the open door, he could hear 2 women talking, one with the quick, energetic rhythm of someone telling a story, and one with a quieter, steadier voice that was making brief and very dry interjections that seemed to be amusing them both. The quiet voice was hers. He did not go in. He stood outside the door for approximately 4 seconds, which he was aware was strange behavior for a king in his own palace, and did not care, and then he walked on. His wolf, which had been pulling east and downward for 3 weeks, had found its direction confirmed, and it settled into something that was less like restlessness, and more like a very determined waiting. He went back to his study. He sat down. He pulled out the border report that Perth had delivered that morning, and forced himself to read every line of it. He read the same paragraph 4 times before anything in it landed. In the workroom below, Elara had paused mid-sentence when the footsteps in the corridor outside slowed and stopped. She had felt it, a sudden sharpening of that low warmth in her chest, like turning up a lamp by a single degree, not dramatic but entirely clear. She had felt the direction of it, pointing toward the open door. Then the footsteps had moved on. She had continued her sentence as though nothing had happened, and Nell had responded, and the conversation had continued, and Elara had kept her hands steady on her work, and her face arranged in the ordinary expression of a person doing ordinary things. Inside, something that had been asking her a question was no longer asking. It had already found its answer. It was just waiting for her to stop refusing to look at it. She was not yet ready to look at it. But ready or not, the thing was there. It had always been there, since the 3 seconds in the corridor when the King of Ashvale had looked at her, and she had not been able to look away. And it was building now, slowly and without her permission, the way weather builds, not with any single dramatic moment, but with the quiet accumulation of conditions that eventually make something impossible to avoid. Outside, the city of Ashvale carried on as it always did. The treaty was progressing. The borders were holding, nervously but holding. The new queen was earning quiet respect from the palace staff with her habit of treating everyone she encountered as a person worth speaking to. And in the lower service corridor of the palace's east wing, the space around a particular seamstress workroom was acquiring a specific quality of attention from a man who had 29 years of practice in not letting things show. He was running out of practice. There was something else he had noticed in the weeks after the wedding, which he had not told Rion and had not told anyone, because it was the kind of observation that resists being shared without sounding either irrational or significant in a way he was not yet prepared to commit to. He had started remembering things from the 3 seconds in the corridor, not replaying them in the way that a person replays a moment they enjoyed or a moment they regretted. More specifically than that, the way she had caught herself against the wall with one hand, the particular efficiency of the movement, not panicked, just fast and practiced. The exact way the fabric had unrolled from under her arm, expensive and silent, down the flagstone floor. The specific quality of her voice when she had said, "I am sorry," before she had even fully regained her footing. The fact that she had started with an apology before she had started with anything else, which, the more he thought about it, the more it told him. And then the 3 seconds itself. The moment of her looking at him and him looking at her, and the quality of that exchange, which had not been the quality of two strangers in an accidental encounter. It had been the quality of recognition between people who do not yet have the context to understand what they are recognizing, but whose interior systems have already registered the fact clearly. He thought about her face in those 3 seconds. He could recall it with a precision that was unusual for a face he had looked at once in low light for a brief moment. Dark eyes, level and direct even in the second of startlement, with a quality in them that he had not been able to name at the time, and was still working on. It was not hardness. It was not its opposite either. It was something more particular than either. The look of someone who had decided, at some point before this corridor, not to be undone by things. He had thought about this enough times now that thinking about it was becoming its own kind of problem. He turned his attention back to the border report. 37% supply reduction in the 3rd sector. He read it twice, and made a note in the margin, and rang for Perth. He would deal with the border report. He would deal with what was in front of him. That was what he did, and what he had always done, and it was not going to stop working as a strategy, simply because something enormous had arrived uninvited in the east corridor of his own palace. Although it was, he was beginning to understand, going to require a more substantial reckoning than he had so far given it. The attack came at 11 at night, which was the hour it was always going to come, because people who plan these things understand that 11 at night is the point at which the first guard rotation has just changed, and the new shift is still fresh from sleep and not yet at full attention. Caden was in his study when the alarm sounded, a low, resonant bell in the east tower that meant a breach in the outer perimeter. Not a distant alarm, not the outer wall, but somewhere inside the palace grounds. He was on his feet before the bell finished its 3rd strike, and he had his command coat on, and his guard at the door before the 4th. "Report," he said, and the door guard, who had clearly been expecting exactly this instruction, had one ready. 3 individuals entered through the lower east garden wall. They were seen by the night watch at the service entrance and pursued. We have lost visual on 2 of them. The 3rd was detained at the lower stable yard. The guard paused. Intelligence suspects they were scouts from the Hollenbrook faction. The timing, the treaty signature is in 4 days, is not a coincidence. Caden moved. He did not run. He was not a man who ran, except in the sense that everything he did was fast and direct. He walked quickly with 2 guards at his sides, and Perth, who had appeared from somewhere down the corridor, with the reliable instinct of a man who always knows when something is about to happen, fell into step behind him. "Full lockdown," Caden said. "Already ordered," Perth said. "Interior doors are sealed. Staff and residents are being moved to the secure rooms. Exterior gates closed." "The 2 who got in?" being swept. We have 6 interior teams working the building now. Perth's voice was even and controlled, the voice of a man who had done this before. We will find them. The lockdown of the palace interior was efficient. Caden moved through the upper floors personally, not because he was needed to, but because standing in his study, while his palace was being searched, was not something his nature would allow. He moved from the upper east wing through the formal reception rooms and down through the first interior level, and with every turn of the corridor his wolf was doing something he had not expected, not focusing on the threat, not tracking the intruders, but pulling east. Pulling down. The same direction it had been pulling for 3 weeks. He told himself to focus. He continued the sweep. Perth's team cleared the formal rooms. The upper-level guards confirmed the gallery and library secure. Reports came in over the next 40 minutes. 1 intruder found and detained in the east storage hall, the second located hiding in a supply room off the lower kitchen corridor, and taken into custody without significant incident. Both were, as suspected, Hollenbrook scouts. They were not armed beyond blades. Their presence was intelligence gathering, not an assault. They were looking for something. The treaty document most likely. Or possibly the advisor correspondence. Caden received this report in the upper hall at a few minutes past midnight, and he should have felt the particular satisfaction of a secured situation. He did not, quite. His wolf was still pulling east, still down. The lower service level, he said. Has it been fully cleared? Perth looked at his report. East workrooms and canteen confirmed clear. Storage rooms confirmed clear. We have 1 more confirmation pending from the far end of the lower east corridor, the section behind the seamstress quarters. I will take that one, Caden said. Perth opened his mouth and then closed it again, with the expression of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to know when arguing is productive and when it is not. Do you want escort? 2 men, quiet. He took the service stairs down. The lower level was lit with emergency torches, oil burning in the wall sconces, rather than the usual lower lamp settings, and it cast everything in a warmer, more irregular light than he was used to down here. The corridor was empty. His boots on the stone floor made a sound that seemed louder than it should in the stillness. He moved through it methodically, checking the workrooms one by one. Empty, empty, empty. The seamstress workroom door was closed. He opened it. Empty. 2 lamps burning low, the work tables covered in fabric and tools, exactly as they would have been left at end of shift. He moved on. At the far end of the corridor, where the hall turned toward the secondary storage area, he found her. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, very still, in the dark section of the corridor, where the torchlight from the main hall did not quite reach. She was wearing her work coat, and she had her bag in front of her, hugged against her chest with both arms. She was not injured. She did not appear to be in distress exactly, but she had the particular expression of someone who has been very still for a long time, because something told them to be, and they had listened without questioning it. She looked up when he appeared, and for a moment she did not react, just looked at him, in the torchlight, with an expression he could not read. His wolf went completely silent. Not quiet, not subdued, silent. The kind of silence that is not the absence of a sound, but the completion of one. The silence after a note that has been building for a long time finally arrives. He looked at her, and it was not like the corridor collision 3 weeks ago, which had been a shock, a disruption, something his logic had managed to half dismiss because the moment was so brief, and he had so many reasons to dismiss it. This was not deniable. This was standing in a torchlit corridor in his own palace at midnight, with 2 guards behind him, and his wolf entirely, absolutely certain, and every rational defense he had built in the past 3 weeks, coming down with a completeness that was almost physical. She was his mate. His wolf knew it the way it knew his own heartbeat, not as a conclusion it had reasoned toward, but as a fact it had always been carrying, waiting for the moment when proximity and clarity arrived at the same time. The certainty was extraordinary. It was also devastating, and he knew it was devastating in the same second that it was certain, because he had married someone else 3 weeks ago in the great hall of this palace, in front of his entire kingdom, and a diplomatic audience of significant importance, and none of that had changed. None of that would change. He stood and looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the silence between them, something enormous and irreversible was happening, without either of them speaking a single word. Then her expression changed. Something moved across her face. Awareness, he thought. She was feeling it too. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her breath came slightly differently, the way she was looking at him with the same quality of recognition that he felt in his own chest. And then she looked away. She looked deliberately, pointedly away, and the expression on her face when she did it was one he recognized, not from his own experience, but from the way people look when they are making a decision under pressure. The specific tightening of someone choosing a direction they have already decided on, not freely, but because the alternatives are worse. "There are guards coming through from the main hall," he said. His voice came out level. He was very glad of that. "The lockdown is being lifted. You can return to the exit in a few minutes." "I know," she said, to the far wall. Her voice was quiet and controlled. He should leave. He had established her safety. He had confirmed the corridor was clear. His guards were behind him, and his duty was back on the upper floors, where the detained scouts were waiting to be interviewed. He did not leave immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked. He had asked her this once before, in a different corridor, and it had been the only thing he could think to say then, too. "Yes," she said, as she had said then. He looked at the side of her face. Her jaw was set. Her hands on the bag she was holding were not entirely relaxed. "I know you work in the seamstress quarters," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes," not a question, not a confirmation, just the word, placed in the space between them with a careful neutrality. He understood, in the way that you sometimes understand several things at once, that she was already protecting herself. That she had felt what he felt, and had already made her assessment of what it meant, and what she intended to do about it, and that assessment involved looking at the wall, rather than at him. He should have found this frustrating. He did not. He found it, without any particular logic to support this feeling, deeply right, as though the quality of her self-possession was part of what he had recognized, part of the thing his wolf had always been waiting for without knowing it. "The corridor will be clear in a few minutes," he said again. "Thank you," she said. He went. He walked back down the corridor, and up the service stairs, and out into the main hall, where Perth was waiting, with a face that was professionally neutral, and a pair of eyes that were doing something more complicated. "All clear?" Perth said. "All clear," Caden said. Perth looked at him for a moment. "Good," he said. They went upstairs. Caden sat in on the interview of the first scout, which was conducted with efficiency, and produced exactly the information they had expected. Hollenbrook was testing the palace's response times before the treaty signing, and the information would now go back to whoever had sent the scouts, and they would decide how to read it. The information they would take back was that the response had been fast and thorough, which was the right message to send 4 days before a signature. He handled it all correctly. He asked the right questions. He made the right decisions. He stayed until the necessary work was done, which was 2 hours past midnight. Then he went to his private chamber and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. His mate had been working in his palace for 6 weeks. She was a seamstress. She was unbonded. She had, at some point before the wedding, been cast from a pack. He knew this from the roster notes, a small and devastatingly matter-of-fact notation. She had been sitting in the dark of a service corridor, entirely alone, during a palace emergency, with her bag held against her chest, and her jaw set, and her face toward the wall, and when he had asked if she was all right, she had said yes, not because she was performing bravery, but because she genuinely did not expect anyone to ask, or to wait for a more complicated answer. He stayed very still for a long time. His wolf was not pulling anymore. It had found its direction, and it was simply present with it now, quiet and certain, in the way that certainty sometimes is, when it has nothing left to prove. He thought about Serene, 2 floors up, asleep in the East Queen's chamber. He thought about the peace treaty. He thought about 40,000 people south of the river crossing whose food routes depended on the agreement being signed in 4 days. He thought about a woman with 2 bags and a work coat and 23 years of starting again. He did not know what to do with any of it. For the first time in 5 years of ruling a kingdom, he did not have a plan. He thought about the night his father had taken him to the Eastern Watchtower at the age of 15 and shown him the border lines in the dark, the way the lights of the neighboring settlements looked from that height, ordinary and warm, and entirely unaware of being watched. His father had said, "Those lights are not your enemies. The people who made them are not your enemies. The systems that set us against each other are the problem, and our job is to find the places where those systems can be changed without tearing everything else down with them." He had been 15, and had nodded without entirely understanding, and he had spent the next 14 years slowly understanding what his father had meant, one difficult year at a time. He thought about what it meant to be in a system that set things against each other. A system that said, "Here is an Omega who cannot bond, and therefore she is insufficient, and therefore she should be removed." A system that said, "Here is a king who must marry for peace, and therefore the personal truth of his nature is secondary, and therefore it should be managed around." Systems that produced their logic cleanly, and enforced it cleanly, and never asked whether the logic was the correct lens for the particular human situation in front of them. He had spent 5 years trying to change the system at the borders. He had not thought, before now, about what it meant that the same kind of thinking that produced war also produced a 23-year-old woman, sitting alone in a storage corridor during an emergency, with her bag against her chest. He was thinking about it now. He knew this was the kind of thought that could become an excuse, the kind of large framing that a person reaches for when they want to justify something personal by attaching it to something principled. He was honest enough with himself not to let it do that. Whatever his feelings about the injustice of what had been done to her, his feelings were not the point. The point was that she was a real person, not a cause. And what she needed from him, if she needed anything at all, was not a king with a grand principle, but a person who was willing to be honest. He could do that. He had done it, imperfectly, his entire life, but he had done it. He was willing to do it now. He did not know what the next thing was. He did not yet know how to hold everything that needed holding simultaneously: the treaty, and the marriage, and the truth of the bond, and the reality of who she was, and what she had come from. He was not someone who pretended to have answers he did not have. He had built his entire style of ruling on the willingness to say out loud, "This is the problem in front of us, and this is what I do not yet know, and here is what I am willing to commit to finding out." He would apply the same principle here. He did not know yet, but he was going to find out. He stood up from the edge of his bed in the dark of his private chamber, and dressed in the last of the night, and went downstairs to the room where the detained scouts were waiting for questioning, and he was precise and thorough and clear-headed through the entire process, because the work in front of him was real and deserved the same quality of attention that everything else in his life deserved. But when it was done, and he was walking back to his chambers in the thin gray of very early morning, the direction was there again, east and downward, steady and specific and patient as a compass needle. He walked past the service stair without slowing. He went to bed. He set his mind on the next day's work and found, after a while, the shallow end of sleep. The direction waited for him when he woke. The treaty was signed on a Wednesday morning, in the palace's formal agreement chamber, before a witness group of 12 that included Elder Dorian, 2 of Serene's senior advisors, and the Hollenbrook and Crestpac representatives, who had arrived 2 days earlier, with the kind of careful formality that tells you exactly how much tension it is covering. Caden signed his name with a steady hand and watched the representatives do the same and thought, "This is what we have been working toward for 5 years. This is what it was all for." He felt the appropriate satisfaction. He also felt like a man standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged slightly, and he cannot stop noticing it. The days since the lockdown had been relentlessly full, which was the only mercy in them. He had reviewed the scout incident with Perth in exhaustive detail. He had met with the treaty legal team twice daily. He had conducted 2 formal receptions for the incoming delegations. He had been exactly what he was supposed to be, in exactly the right places, at exactly the right times. And every morning when he walked the lower hall on his way from the East Wing, and every afternoon when his route took him past the service corridor, and every evening when the palace settled around him, and his wolf was still and certain, and oriented in one direction, every single time, he had kept walking. He had not gone to the workroom. He had not found another reason to be in that particular corridor at that particular time. He had not asked Oliver for the staff roster again, or looked at the notation beside her name, or done anything, in the 10 days since the lockdown, that could be described as acting on what he knew. This was not easy. He wanted to be honest with himself about that. After the treaty signing, when the formal party dispersed, and the morning opened into the particular quiet of a significant thing completed. Rian appeared beside him, with 2 cups of tea from the canteen, and handed one over without comment. They drank in silence for a moment, in the corridor outside the agreement chamber. "We should talk," Caden said. "Yes," Rian agreed. "We should." They went to Caden's private study, and Rian closed the door, and Caden stood at the window with his tea and said, without preamble and without making it dramatic, "My wolf has identified a mate." Rian sat down. He did not say anything. He was very good at this. "Since the wedding," Caden said, "the evening of," he paused. "It is someone in the palace." "Staff," Rian said, "not a question. Lower service level." Another pause. "Her name is Alara Vane. She was brought in for the wedding preparations. She is a seamstress. She was cast from her pack." He said the last sentence carefully, watching Rian's face. Rian's face remained professionally composed, which was both his nature and his skill, but something passed across it briefly, that Caden recognized as concern. Not the sharp situational concern of an immediate problem, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles in when you understand the full scope of something. "You are certain," Rian said. "Yes. And she knows." "I believe she does. The lockdown. We were alone in the corridor." He stopped. She turned away. Rian was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Tell me what you want me to do." Caden turned from the window. "I want you to find out what you can about her history. Not intrusively, I will not have her made into a file on a desk, but I want to know who she was before she came here. Her pack. What happened?" He paused. "I want to understand what she came from." Rian nodded once. "And the other question?" Caden looked at him. "The one you are not saying," Rian said, with the patience of someone who does not require the word to be spoken to understand what it is. A long silence. Then Caden said, "I do not know. I do not know yet." Rian finished his tea, set the cup down, and stood up. "I will be careful," he said. He went to the door, paused, and then said without turning around, "For what it is worth, the fact that she turned away, that is not a rejection. That is a person who has learned to protect herself." He paused. "There is a difference." He left. Caden stood at the window for a long time after he was gone. What Rian found, over the next 4 days, was not difficult to discover. The difficulty was in receiving it. The Morrow Pack, a small residential pack in the working quarter of the capital, had removed Alara Vane from its register approximately 8 weeks before the wedding. The notation in the city's shared pack record was brief and bureaucratic. Removal for failure to integrate. Standard administrative process. Her name was in the register before that for 6 years, with no notable events recorded, no conflicts, no formal complaints, no disciplinary matters. She had simply existed inside the pack for 6 years, without generating any paper trail, which was itself a kind of quiet story, if you knew how to read it. People who generate no paper trail in a pack setting are usually people who have made themselves very small. Before the Morrow Pack, Rian found records of her in 2 other small communities, one in the outer city, one in a rural settlement 2 days' travel east, both of which she had left under similar circumstances. Unbonded Omega. Did not integrate in the ways the pack required. Removed. He found, with a little more effort, the record of her birth pack in the eastern region, a mid-sized community where she had been born, and where she had remained until the age of 17, when the formal determination had been made that she had no bonding potential, and she had been quietly encouraged to seek placement elsewhere. Formally encouraged to leave her birth pack at 17, for failing to produce a bond that she had no control over. Rian brought this information to Caden in a single typed sheet, set on the desk without comment. Caden read it once. Then he read it again. Then he put it face down on the desk and stood up and walked to the window, which was becoming a habit, because the window gave him something to look at that was not a problem he had already decided needed solving, and was still trying to figure out how. He thought about 17. He thought about being told at 17 that you were insufficient in a way that was biological and therefore presumably permanent, and being asked to leave the home you had grown up in because of it. He had been 17 when his father first took him to the border fortifications and showed him the scope of what he would one day be responsible for. He remembered the particular weight of that, not heavy in a bad way, not crushing, but substantial, real, the weight of something that mattered, He had left that day with a sense of purpose that had never entirely left him, even on the worst days. He tried to imagine leaving that day instead with the information that he was not enough, and being sent away with it. He could not fully imagine it. He tried anyway, because it seemed important to try. He thought about the corridor during the lockdown, the way she had sat with her bag held against her chest and her face toward the wall. Not afraid, exactly, but somewhere in the landscape adjacent to it. The way she had said yes when he asked if she was all right, automatic and clean. The answer of someone who has learned that saying otherwise does not produce anything useful. He thought about 6 years in a pack that had not wanted her enough to keep her. He thought about Rion's 3 words from the morning of the treaty. There is a difference between rejection and self-protection. He turned from the window, sat back down at his desk, and wrote a short note. He did not address it by name. He wrote, "I would like to speak with you privately when you are willing, not as king to staff, simply as 2 people who have encountered something I believe we are both aware of. If you would prefer not to meet, I will respect that entirely. You may leave your answer with Oliver." He sealed it. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he called for Oliver. Oliver, to his credit, took the note without any visible change of expression, and asked only if there was a time preference attached. "No," Caden said. "It is entirely her choice." Oliver left. Alara received the note at the end of a workday, tucked inside the regular end-of-shift inventory slip that Oliver distributed to each station. She picked it up without particular attention, unfolded it, and read it while standing at her workstation, in the process of putting away her scissors and measuring roll. She read it twice. Then she stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Nell, who was 2 stations away, and had glanced over, because Alara had gone unusually still, said nothing. She looked at Alara, assessed the expression on her face with the speed of someone who has become very good at reading people, and then looked deliberately back at her own work. Alara put the note inside her coat pocket, finished putting away her tools, said a quiet good evening to the workroom in general, and left. She walked home through the evening streets without particular hurry. It was a gray evening, cool and damp, not quite raining but thinking about it. The city around her moved with its usual end-of-workday rhythm. People heading home, shops closing, the smell of food from open windows. She walked, and she thought. She was not naive about what the note meant. She was not naive about any of it. She had known, since the moment in the storage corridor when the King of Ashvale had walked toward her through the torchlight, and everything in her chest had gone perfectly clear, exactly what she was dealing with. She had lived her entire life being told she was incapable of producing a bond, that she was the kind of Omega who simply did not have the right quality of connection in her for this particular thing. 6 packs, 3 formal rejections, 17 years of being insufficient. And then a 3-second collision in a corridor, and a midnight encounter in the dark. And now, a note on palace letterhead saying, "I believe we are both aware of something." The irony of it was extraordinary. She was very nearly tempted to find it funny, because the alternative was something more complicated. She thought about what she wanted. This was itself unusual. She was not in the habit of starting from what she wanted, because in her experience, starting from what she wanted had not historically produced useful outcomes. But she sat with it tonight, walking through the gray evening, and tried to be honest. She wanted to not be anyone's problem. She wanted to not be a situation that required managing. She had spent enough of her life being a situation. The Omega who would not bond, the member who would not integrate, the quiet one in the corner of the workroom who could be counted on to leave when asked. She also wanted, under all of that, and running deeper than she usually let herself go, to be seen by someone who was actually capable of the seeing. She arrived at Mrs. Fallon's house. She went up to her room. She sat at the small table for a while without lighting the lamp. Then she took out a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote a reply. She wrote, "I am willing to meet once. I will come to wherever is private and convenient for you. But I want you to understand before we speak that I am not interested in being anyone's comfortable secret or anyone's difficulty to be arranged. If what you want to discuss requires me to be either of those things, I would prefer to stay in the workroom. If it does not, then I will come." She folded it and sealed it. She went downstairs, walked the 3 streets to the palace's east entrance, knocked, gave the note to the night intake attendant with Oliver's name on the outside, and walked home. She climbed the stairs. She lay down on her bed. The warmth in her chest was constant now, no longer something she could pretend was something else. It was specific, and particular, and steady, and it pointed in the same direction it always had, and she was very tired of pretending she did not know what it meant. She was going to meet him. She had known she was going to, when she sealed the note. But she was going to meet him as herself. For the first time in her life, she was going to walk into a room where she was the least powerful person in it, and do it on her own terms. She had decided. Outside, the gray evening had finally made up its mind, and it began to rain. She had pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and had written that reply without allowing herself to agonize over the wording, because agonizing over the wording was what she did when she was trying to manage how she appeared, rather than say what she meant. She knew this about herself. She had written it quickly and honestly, and sealed it before the part of her brain that wanted to make things safer could revise it into something less clear. She lay now in the dark of her room, and thought about what she had written, and decided that she still meant all of it. The not being a secret part, especially. She had spent 6 years being a secret, in the specific sense that the Morrow Pack had been very good at presenting a certain kind of public cohesion, while quietly managing the element within it that did not fully fit. She had not been discussed. She had simply been navigated around, like a piece of furniture placed inconveniently, that everyone learns to step around rather than move. The result was the same as being invisible, but it was worse in one specific way. It required her active cooperation. She had cooperated. She had been small and quiet and useful and undemanding, and at the end of 6 years the pack leader had read from a paper in a doorway in a voice that carried no emotion, because managing her out was so practiced and painless by then that it did not even produce discomfort for the people doing it. She was not going to cooperate with that again. That was the only thing she was entirely certain about in a situation that was otherwise full of uncertainty. She thought about Mrs. Fallon's house, which was the most stable place she had lived in since her childhood, and which she had built herself out of wages and work and the particular determination of someone who has learned not to wait for anyone to build things for them. She thought about Nell, who had sat across from her in the palace canteen and asked, "Is it the king?" without any judgment in her voice, just information gathering and the readiness to be present with whatever the answer was. She thought about the note she had written, sealed, and sent. And she thought, whatever happens tomorrow, I wrote it as myself. That is something I could not have said a year ago. A year ago I would have written whatever I thought was most likely to produce the smallest amount of disruption. She had not written that. She had written what she meant. That was going to have to be enough for tonight. Oliver delivered the reply the following morning. Caden read it at his desk, before any of the day's other correspondence, because it had arrived in a separate envelope, and Oliver had placed it on top of the stack with a neutrality that was, in its own way, communicating something. He read it twice, the way he read things that required his full attention. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She had said she was willing to meet. She had also said, in plain and careful language, exactly what she was not willing to be. Not a secret, not a difficulty requiring arrangement. She had said it without apology, without hedging, without softening it down to something more comfortable. She had simply stated it, and left the space for him to decide what to do with it. He found this so completely, unexpectedly correct, that it took him a moment to find the appropriate response. He wrote back, neither of those things. A room in the East Residential Wing, 3rd floor. Tomorrow evening at 7, if you are willing. No guards at the door. You may leave whenever you choose. He sent it down with Oliver. Her answer came back in 2 hours. I will be there. He spent the rest of that day in the usual work. Boundary adjustment meetings, trade route updates, the post-signing communications that flowed in from the treaty partners. He handled all of it with his standard efficiency. He also spent a significant and unscheduled amount of mental energy deciding what he intended to say to her, which was unusual for him, because he was generally a person who knew what he wanted to say before he walked into a room. The difficulty here was that there was no version of this situation that had a clean answer, and he was accustomed to looking for clean answers. There was a bond between them that was real, and not of his making and not of hers. There was a marriage that was also real and not symbolic. It was the frame around a peace that 40,000 people south of the river crossing were depending on. There was a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was not enough, and who had written him a note saying she was not interested in being a comfortable secret. These things did not resolve neatly, he knew that. He had spent the past 10 days learning to sit with the fact that they did not resolve neatly. What he knew was simpler than a resolution. He knew that he was not going to pretend this was not happening. He knew that she deserved honesty, the specific, particular kind of honesty that had been withheld from her by 6 different communities, in 6 different versions of the same message. You do not have what it takes to belong here. He was not going to add to that collection. Beyond that, he did not yet know. He was willing to say so. The 3rd floor East residential wing had a small sitting room that was technically a guest waiting room, but was almost never used because the guest rooms on that floor were rarely occupied. He chose it because it was neither formal enough to feel like a summons, nor private enough to feel inappropriate. It had 2 chairs, a low table, a window, and a door that locked from the inside with an ordinary bolt. He told no one he would be there. Alara arrived at 3 minutes past 7. He heard her footsteps in the corridor, steady and unhurried, before she knocked. She knocked twice, firmly, not like someone who is uncertain about knocking. He opened the door. She was in her work coat, which told him she had come directly from the lower level without changing, or possibly that she had made a deliberate point of not changing. Her hair was down from its usual braid, not because it was styled differently, but because the braid had been let out at the end of the day and left. She looked exactly as she always looked, not as she might look if she had tried to look like something other than what she was. She looked at him and did not say anything initially. He stepped back. "Thank you for coming," he said. She came in. She did not sit immediately. She looked at the room, a quick, thorough assessment, the kind of person does when they are making sure they understand the space they are in, and then she chose the chair that had its back to the wall and its face to the door, and she sat down. He sat across from her. Neither of them had tea or anything that would require the small performance of hospitality in receiving it. He was glad of that. It would have felt like theater. A moment of silence that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was very dense. He said, "I want to be honest with you." "Good," she said. "Nothing else. Just good. My wolf identified a bond 3 weeks ago, on the evening of the wedding, in the East Corridor." He watched her face. "I believe you know this." "Yes," she said. "I spent the following weeks trying to be reasonable about it," he said. "I want you to know that. I tried very hard to find the version of this that was not what it appears to be, that it was the stress of the day, or the difficulty of the circumstances, or something that would diminish with time. Did it? No," he said simply. "It did not." She looked at him. Her expression was guarded. Not closed, exactly, but the kind of guarded that comes not from choosing to hide something, but from having learned, through long practice, that what is inside you is safer when it is not immediately visible. "I know something of your history," he said. "I want to acknowledge that this may feel like one more thing in a long sequence of things that have happened to you without your agreement." She went very still. "I asked Rion to look into your pack record," he said. "I want to be transparent about that. I am not going to apologize for it, because I needed to understand, but I am telling you I did it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was doing something complicated, not moving, but thinking, behind her eyes. "What did you find?" she said. "That you have been rejected by every community you have ever belonged to, on the grounds that you could not produce a bond." He paused. "And that those communities were wrong." The silence after that was different from the one before it. She did not look away. But something in her expression shifted. Not breaking, not softening exactly, but something moving, like a fault line in ground that has been under pressure for a very long time. "You do not know that," she said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it steady, and the work was not quite invisible. "I do know it," he said. "Because you are producing one now, and so am I. And it is the realest thing in this room, which is itself full of real things." He paused. "I am sorry that it took this long to find you. I am sorry that the finding is this complicated. But I am not sorry that it is real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make the situation tidier." Alara looked at him, and the thing she had been carrying in her chest for 6 weeks, the warmth, the direction, the thing she had been calling an absence of nothing, and a presence she refused to name, sat very loud and very clear in the space between her sternum and her spine. and she was very tired of not naming it. "You are married," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not make it less than it was. "I am." "And the treaty?" "Depends on the marriage." "I know that too." He paused. "I am not going to pretend those things are not true. I am not standing here offering you something comfortable. I am standing here telling you the truth." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said something that she had not planned to say, something that had been building in her for so long that when it came out flat and direct, without the protective wrapping she usually put around anything that was actually important. "Do you know," she said, "how many rooms I have sat in and been told what I am not, what I cannot do, what I have failed to be?" Her voice was even. It was not even because she was calm. It was even because she had made a decision about how this was going to go, and she was keeping to it. "I was removed from my birth pack at 17. Not because I did something wrong, because I could not produce something that apparently everyone else could produce, with no particular effort, and my failure to produce it made me inconvenient." She stopped. "And now you are sitting across from me, and telling me that actually I can, that I always could, that the thing everyone told me I was missing was simply waiting for you, and I am supposed to, what, feel relieved? Feel grateful?" He did not try to answer immediately. He let the words land. "No," he said, when the silence had given them both enough room. "I do not think you should feel grateful. I think you should feel angry. You have earned the anger. I am not asking you to set it down." He paused. "I am asking you simply to hear this. You are not insufficient. You were not insufficient at 17, or at any of the years that came after it. What was done to you on those grounds was wrong. The bond you could not produce for any of those packs was not absent. It simply had not found its other half." She looked at him. The flatness in her expression had not disappeared, but underneath it, something was moving. "That does not fix anything," she said. "No," he said. "It does not. It does not give me back the years. No, nothing does that. And it does not give you a simple answer to the situation you are in." "No," he said again. "It does not. I do not have a simple answer. I have told you the truth of what is here, and I have told you honestly that the complications are real, and I cannot resolve them by wanting to." He looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you for anything. I am asking you to know that what you are is not what you were told you were. And I am asking if you are willing to talk to me, not to solve anything, just to talk." She looked at him for a long time. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the evening city carried on with its ordinary sounds, distant, real, indifferent to the two people in the small third-floor sitting room. Then she said, "You said no guards at the door." "No guards," he confirmed. "And I can leave whenever I choose." "Yes." She leaned back very slightly in her chair, a fraction of an inch, barely visible, but it was there. "Then I will talk to you," she said. "But I am not going to pretend to be fine with things that are not fine. And I am not going to make myself smaller so the situation is easier to manage." "I would not ask you to," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the particular quality of that exchange was something that had not been in any of their previous encounters, not the collision, not the lockdown, not the recognition from across a closed workroom door. This was something more deliberate, more chosen. A meeting of two people who had both decided to stop pretending they were not looking directly at the thing between them. It was not resolved. It was nowhere near resolved. It was, in fact, the beginning of the most complicated series of conversations either of them had ever needed to have. But it was honest. For Alara, who had spent her whole life being managed and arranged and quietly moved along, honest was something. It was, in fact, quite a lot. She did not leave for 2 hours. They talked, about her work, about the palace, about small things first, and then gradually about larger ones. He did not push. She set the pace, which he was clearly aware of and clearly willing to respect, and she found this so different from her expectation of a king in his own palace that she had to recalibrate her internal model of him partway through. When she finally stood to leave, he stood too, which was a formality she had not expected, and which briefly disrupted her composure more than anything else that had happened in the entire evening. "Thank you for coming," he said. She looked at him. "You said that when I arrived." I mean it twice, he said. She left. She walked down the stairs, and through the lower corridor, and out through the east exit into the night, and she stood on the pavement outside the palace wall for a moment, and put her hand against the stone, and breathed. The warmth in her chest was so clear and steady now that she could not remember what it had felt like without it. She thought about this, briefly, and then she thought, this is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to you, and you went in there anyway. She took her hand from the wall. She walked home. She was not fine. She was not resolved. She was not in a good or simple situation. But she had, for the first time in as long as she could remember, told a room exactly who she was and what she would and would not accept, and the room had listened. She was not yet sure what to do with that. But she was going to find out. She had not intended to stay 2 hours. The time had simply passed in the way it sometimes does when a conversation is doing the thing that conversations rarely do, actually moving somewhere, actually producing clarity rather than accumulating more careful noise. She had told him things she had not told anyone in years, not because the room was safe exactly, but because he had been honest with her first, and matched her directness without flinching from it. And somewhere in that exchange, the habit of compression that she had built so carefully over so many years had simply found less reason to hold. She had told him about the birth pack, about being 17, and being told in the particular administrative language of a pack council that she was being formally released, which was how they named the thing that felt, from the inside, like being expelled from the only home she had ever known. She had told him about the 2 years after that, the way she had learned to move quickly and leave quietly, and not build anything she would need to carry, because carrying things was painful and unnecessary if you were going to lose them anyway. She had told him about arriving in the capital and the Moro pack and the 6 years of being small and functional, and grateful for the space she was given. She had not told him these things as grievances. She had told them as facts, which was how she had come to carry them, not as wounds that needed attention, but as the record of a particular life, specific and detailed, and hers. He had listened the way he did everything, with full, quiet attention, not rushing to respond, and not filling her pauses with noise. And when she had finished, he had not said anything immediately, which was correct, because the worst thing he could have done in that moment was produce an immediate response, as though what she had said required only a small amount of processing. He had waited a decent interval and then said, "I am glad you told me." She had looked at him. "Not because it is useful information," he had said, "because you told it to me as yourself, as the record of your actual life, not a softened version of it." He had paused. "I want you to know that I understand it is not ordinary to do that. I do not take it lightly." She had looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the window, which was easier, and said, "I told you because you were honest first. It seemed fair." "It was fair," he said, "and it was also brave." She had left shortly after that, not because the conversation was finished, but because she had reached the point where she needed to process what had happened, somewhere on her own, outside the room. She had said a simple good evening and gone, and he had stood when she stood, which was the detail that had lodged in her on the walk home in a way she had not fully examined yet. She had been stood for, in the formal sense of courtesy, by a king, in his own palace, as though she were someone whose leaving from the room deserved acknowledgement. It was very small. It was also not nothing. In the full and honest accounting of her 23 years, it was not nothing at all. Serene Aldrich Voss noticed the change in her husband 11 days after the treaty signing, which was, by her own internal accounting, approximately 11 days later than she might have noticed it had she been paying attention earlier. But the post-signing period had been genuinely demanding for both of them: ceremonial visits, correspondence, the formal establishment of the new diplomatic frameworks, and she had been occupied enough that the particular quality of Caden's distraction had simply registered as another form of the quiet, disciplined focus she had come to understand as his default mode. It was during a morning briefing on the Hollenbrook trade route finalization that she caught it clearly. She was speaking. He was listening. He looked, to any outside observer, exactly as he always looked: attentive, steady, taking in information with the efficient speed of someone who does not need things repeated. But something was slightly off, and Serene had spent enough of her life reading rooms full of people who were performing one thing while carrying another, to recognize the very precise quality of a person who is present, and also, somewhere beneath the present, not quite here. She finished the briefing. The two advisors with them packed up their notes and left. She and Caden remained at the table, which had not been specifically planned. She looked at him. He looked back. They had, in the 6 weeks of their marriage, developed a working language between them that was efficient and respectful, and contained, she thought, the genuine foundations of a real mutual regard. She liked him. This was not something she had predicted or required. She had walked into this arrangement prepared to find him capable and honest, and to consider that enough. She had found those things, and also something warmer underneath them, which she had filed away as a pleasant development. She said, "There is something you have not told me." He did not try to deny it. She appreciated this. "Yes," he said. "Is it related to the treaty?" "No." "To the scouts?" "No." She looked at him steadily. "Is it something I should know?" A pause. The kind of pause that is not evasion, but careful thought. "I think," he said, "that it may affect you." "Yes, eventually." Another pause. "I want to be honest with you about it. I have been deciding how." Serene folded her hands on the table. She was very good at stillness. "Tell me now then," she said. "I prefer honesty to consideration. It is a faster process." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face, brief and genuine, and gone again. Then he said, "My wolf has identified a bond. A true bond. It happened on the evening of the wedding." He paused. "There is a woman in the palace. She works in the lower service level. She is a seamstress." Serene looked at him. She did not say anything for a long moment. She sat with it, which was how she processed most things. Not with immediate reaction, but with the careful examination of what she actually felt before she responded to it. She had found, over the years, that this habit produced far better outcomes than the alternative. What she actually felt was more complicated than she would have predicted, and also less painful than she might have feared. She had known, when she agreed to this arrangement, that it was not a mating bond. She had been clear about this with herself, with her father, with her own counsel, with Caden himself on their first meeting. She had said, "I know what this is." She had meant it. She still meant it. But she had also, over 6 weeks of sharing a palace and a purpose with this particular man, developed the specific kind of regard for him that made honesty, his willingness to tell her this, directly, before it became a secret, feel like the most important thing he could have done. "A seamstress," she said. "Yes. And does she know?" "She knows. I have spoken with her." He paused. "She came to me with the same clarity she brings to everything. She was not interested in being managed or arranged. She told me so directly." Another pause. "She is someone who has been badly treated for most of her life, and she is not willing to continue being treated that way. I respect that." Serene was quiet for a moment. "Are you in love with her?" she asked. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. Not quite uncertainty, but something close to its honest cousin. "I do not know yet what it is," he said carefully. "I know it is real. I know it is the thing I have not felt in 29 years of waiting. I know that she is someone who deserves to have it treated with the seriousness it deserves." He paused. "I am not trying to minimize what this means for you. I am not going to tell you it does not matter." "It matters," she said. "That is accurate." She looked at the table for a moment, then back up at him. "But let me tell you something honest in return." He waited. "When I agreed to this marriage, I told you I was not here under any illusion. I meant that in a specific way. Not only that I understood the political nature of it, but that I had looked at it clearly and accepted it as what it was." She paused. "I have come to respect you, genuinely. And what you are doing right now, telling me this, to my face, without dressing it in comfortable language, is exactly the behavior of the man I believed I was making this arrangement with." She paused again. "I will not pretend that I am entirely indifferent to the implications of what you have just told me. But I am also not going to behave as though a truth, clearly spoken, is an attack on me." He looked at her. "The treaty," she said, "is what we made it for. It stands on the legal framework, not on sentiment. I am committed to it. I believe you are too." She folded her hands more precisely on the table. "The question of what happens between you and this woman, and between all three of us, in whatever arrangement reality requires, is a separate question, and one that probably requires more conversation than a single morning briefing can accommodate. Yes, he said. But I want to have that conversation, she said. All of it, including the parts that are uncomfortable. I would rather know everything clearly than be managed around a situation I am not being told about. She paused. I am very good at managing complexity. I would prefer the opportunity to do so with full information, he said. I would not expect anything different from you. She nodded. What is her name? Alara Vane. Is she well? He looked slightly surprised by the question. Yes, he said. I believe so. Good, Serene said. And she meant it, which was perhaps the most unexpected thing about the whole conversation, but which was also, she thought, the truest thing she could offer. A woman who had been poorly treated for most of her life and who had, apparently, arrived at a situation as unexplained and unasked for as Serene's own. That woman deserved to be well. They remained at the table for another hour after that. They talked about the treaty and the upcoming state visits, and the eastern border adjustments, because these things also needed attending to, and neither of them was the kind of person who suspended their duties because something personal had become complicated. But there was a quality to the conversation that had shifted, less careful, more open, the particular ease that sometimes exists between two people who have both elected to simply tell each other the truth. At the end of it, as she rose to go to her own morning schedule, Serene said, "Bring her to meet me, when she is willing." Caden looked at her. "Not as a performance," Serene said. "Not a formal introduction. Just, she is part of this situation, and so am I. And I would rather know the person than the concept." She paused. "If she is anything like what you are describing, she will find it uncomfortable, and would rather have the meeting be simple." He said, "She will probably find the whole idea alarming." "Probably," Serene agreed. "But I suspect she will come anyway. She does not sound like someone who avoids things simply because they are alarming." She left for her morning appointments. Caden sat at the table alone for a moment, then got up and went to his own desk, where Perth's latest border report was waiting, and the morning was still far from over. He told Rian that afternoon, who received the information about the meeting with Serene, with the same deliberate quietness he received most things, and then said, "She agreed?" "More than agreed," Caden said. "She requested to meet Alara." Rian looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "She is either an extraordinary person, or the most composed woman I have ever encountered." "Both," Caden said. "Good," Rian said. "You are going to need both." The news, however, did not stay as contained as Caden would have preferred. By the end of the following week, it had begun to move. Serene's two senior advisors were perceptive people who had spent their careers reading diplomatic situations, and they could read personal ones with the same facility. Neither of them said anything openly, but a particular alertness had entered their behavior. Small adjustments in how they positioned themselves in meetings, a new quality of attention when the king entered a room. They had not been told anything, they had simply noticed, and noticing was enough to begin the process. One of the junior kitchen staff, a young man named Philip, had told his friend in the lower storeroom that he had seen the king in the lower east corridor twice in 1 week, which was unusual enough to mention, because the king almost never came below the formal service level without a specific purpose. His friend had mentioned it to someone else. By the end of the week, it had become a fragment of palace gossip, undefined and without specific content, simply the awareness that something was in motion around the lower service level that had not been in motion before. And then there was Nell. Nell, who had been watching Alara with the quiet precision of a woman who notices what other people miss, had noticed when Alara came in on the morning after the first meeting, with the kind of composure that is specifically worn by someone who has just been through something significant. She had noticed when Alara came in on the morning after the second meeting, with the same quality, slightly warmer, slightly less guarded. She had said nothing and offered nothing, until she did. On a Thursday, at lunch, she said simply, "Is it the king?" Alara looked at her. Nell looked back with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time to say this, and would prefer not to wait longer. "Yes," Alara said. Nell nodded. She picked up her fork. She appeared, briefly, to consider saying several things, and then select from among them. "Are you all right?" she said. "I do not know," Alara said, which was the most honest answer she had. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Is he treating you?" He is treating me like a person, Alara said, which is, I am aware, a lower bar than it should be. But yes, he is. She paused. He is also married, and his marriage is important, and the whole situation is impossible. Nell nodded again. Yes, she said, I can see that. They ate in silence for a while. Then Nell said, What are you going to do? Alara said, I have no idea. Nell said, That is probably the most honest thing anyone in your position has ever said. And Alara looked at her, and for a moment, something in her chest that was not the warmth of the bond but was adjacent to it, the specific warmth of another person being actually, genuinely present with you, made itself known. Thank you, Alara said. I am not doing anything, Nell said. You are here, Alara said. That is something. Outside the canteen window, the city moved through its afternoon, at its usual pace, indifferent to the particular knots of human difficulty being quietly worked through inside the palace walls. A cart rattled over the cobblestones. 2 pigeons quarreled on a window ledge across the street and then flew off separately. Inside, a woman who had spent her whole life being too small for the room she was in, sat in a canteen and told the truth to the only person who had ever thought to ask. It was not nothing. In the full accounting of her life, it was actually a great deal. Caden received his own version of the same day's news that evening, when Rion brought him a brief summary of what had been overheard in the outer corridors. Not surveillance, simply the ordinary way that information moves in a building of people who pay attention. The palace's internal whisper network had not yet produced anything specific or named. What it had produced was a quality of attention, a sharpening of observation among the staff that told anyone who knew how to read it that people had noticed something and were watching to see what it became. He sat with Rion for half an hour going through what was known and what was inference and what was noise, the way he had always done when intelligence was incomplete, which was most of the time. The things that were known were these. 3 senior staff members had drawn conclusions. The Eastern diplomatic channels were acquiring an unusual alertness, and in the lower service level, a specific quality of warmth had entered the environment around the seamstress workroom that was different from anything it had contained in the weeks before. This last item Rion did not say directly. He said instead, the staff in the lower service quarters seem to feel that the current situation reflects well on the palace, on how it handles its people. Caden looked at him. Rion looked back with the expression of someone who has chosen their words with great precision. They know she is not being hidden, Caden said. They know she is being treated with honesty, Rion said. In an environment where most people expect situations of this kind to be managed quietly, and the person at the less powerful end of them to be arranged around, that is notable. A pause. People remember how things like this are handled. Staff remember particularly. They watch for it. Caden nodded. For what it is worth, Rion said, which was his way of prefacing something he had thought about enough to choose to say. The way she handled the conversation with you, what you described to me, that is not the behavior of someone who is going to be made into a problem by this. She knows her own mind. She is not going to be destabilized by a complicated situation. She has survived a great deal more destabilizing than this. He paused. That does not make the situation simple. It makes it more manageable than it could have been. Caden said, Nothing about this is manageable in the way I would prefer things to be manageable. No, Rion agreed. But it is honest. And in my experience, honest is actually more stable than managed, even though it feels less controllable. Another pause. Because managed things depend on the management holding, and honest things depend on the truth holding. The truth is generally more reliable. Caden looked at his desk. She wrote to me that she is not interested in being a comfortable secret, he said. Rion said nothing. She is right about that, Caden said. I know she is right about that. The question is what the honest version of this situation looks like, and whether I have the ability to build it in the space I have to build it in. He paused. I do not yet know the answer to that. No, Rion said. But you know the direction. Caden looked at him. Rion stood. East, he said simply, and left. The first public noise about it came from the east. It arrived, as most destabilizing things do, not as a single event, but as a pattern. Small signals over several days that Rion was the first to recognize for what they were. A mention in a courier dispatch from the Crest Pack's northern representative, phrased as an innocent inquiry about palace staffing changes, a shift in tone in the Hollenbrook trade delegation's correspondence, a sharpening of language that had been deliberately eased in the weeks following the treaty signing, a report from one of Perth's intelligence contacts that a particular conversation had taken place in the Eastern Assembly, a conversation that involved a palace seamstress, a king, and the word mismatch in the context of the formal marriage. Rian laid this out for Caden on a Monday morning, with his characteristic economy of language. "They know something," he said. "Not everything. Enough." Caden was standing at the window again. He had been standing at a window a great deal recently. He turned around when Rian finished. "What specifically?" "There is information circulating in the Eastern faction, specifically Hollenbrook, that the marriage may not be as consolidated as it appeared. The language being used is careful. They are not making accusations. They are asking questions, which is worse. Questions are more difficult to disprove than accusations." Rian paused. "The Hollenbrook representative has formally requested a confidence meeting with you for later this week." Caden said, "What do they want?" "We will not know until the meeting. But based on the pattern of their communications over the past 10 days, the theory we have to work with is this. They believe there is something in the king's household that is not settled. They want to determine whether that unsettled thing represents an opportunity." Rian paused. "They are not wrong that something is not settled. The question is whether the unsettled thing affects the treaty framework, and the answer to that is no. But convincing a faction that has been looking for a pressure point, that the pressure point does not lead anywhere useful, is a different conversation." Caden absorbed this. Who else has heard? At this point, within the palace walls, the number of people who know something specific is still small, but the number of people who have observed enough to generate their own conclusion is growing. He paused. Serene's advisors. 3 members of the senior staff. Nell, the seamstress, though I believe she is unlikely to be a source of any further dispersal, and likely, by now, 2 or 3 of the lower service staff who pay attention. Perth? Perth has said nothing to me. He knows something. He also knows better than to say something to me before you do. Caden turned back to the window. Below, the palace gardens were in the last of the autumn. The trees stripped of most of their leaves, the beds prepared for winter, everything laid down and quiet and patient. He thought about the treaty. He thought about 40,000 people south of the river crossing, and the grain routes, and the particular, grinding precariousness of a peace that had not yet had enough time to develop roots. He thought about Alara, who had told him in a small room on the 3rd floor that she was not interested in being anyone's comfortable secret, and who deserved to have that request honored, rather than slowly, quietly violated by the creep of palace politics, until she found herself hidden without having agreed to it. He thought about Serene, who had said bring her to meet me when she is willing, and who had, in 3 weeks since their difficult morning briefing, given him every indication that she was going to handle this with more grace than he had any right to expect. "I need to speak with Serene," he said. "Yes," Rian said. "And I need to speak with Alara." "Also yes," Rian said. "In that order, I would suggest." He found Serene in the library, which was where she spent her late mornings, when no meetings were scheduled. She was reading something and making notes in the margin in her small, precise handwriting, and she looked up when he came in without marking her page, because she was the kind of person who could find her place again. He sat in the chair across from her and told her what Rian had told him. She listened with the quality of attention she brought to everything, full and still, and not performing patience but actually patient. When he finished, she set her book on the arm of the chair and said, "They are going to try to use this." "Yes." "The question is what using it looks like," she said. "If they believe the marriage is genuinely unstable, if they think there is something here that could be exploited to fracture the treaty alignment, they will move on it in the next few weeks before it has time to stabilize further. But if they understand that the treaty stands regardless, and that this is a personal matter, that the parties involved have addressed between themselves, the calculation changes." She paused. "What would close off their angle?" He said, carefully, demonstrating that the people in this situation are handling it themselves, openly, without it being a crisis. She looked at him. "You mean demonstrating that I know, and that I have not considered it a fracture?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a significant thing to demonstrate publicly." "I know. It would require either a formal statement which would be its own complicated document, or a public gesture that communicates stability without explanation. She thought for a moment. The state reception next week. The Hollenbrook delegation is attending. Serene Aldrich Voss, the Alpha King, and the full court. She paused. If at that reception, the situation within this household is visibly, not performed, but genuine, it is a different message than anything a statement could convey. He said, "You are talking about a reception where Alara is present. I am talking about a reception where the people at the center of this situation are not pretending the situation does not exist," Serene said. "Which is different." She looked at him. "Have you told her?" "Not yet. I came to you first." "Good," Serene said. "Tell her everything. She deserves to make a choice with full information, not a partial one." She paused. "And if she decides not to come, I understand that completely, and I will think of another approach." She picked up her book again. "But tell her everything." He left the library. He sent a note to the lower workroom asking if Alara could meet him, and he had a reply within the hour. Same room, same time, this evening. She was already there when he arrived, which was different from the first time when he had been waiting for her knock. She had arrived 5 minutes early and was sitting in the same chair, the one with its back to the wall, and she had a cup of tea from somewhere that she was holding in both hands. He sat down and looked at her and said, "I have to tell you something that is not good news." She looked at him. "Tell me." He told her everything. He told her about Rion's report, about the Eastern factions, about the shift in Hollenbrook's communication. He told her about what he and Serene had discussed. He told her about the reception. He told her Serene's suggestion, and he told her that Serene had said specifically that if she did not wish to come, she should not. She listened with her hands around her tea, and her eyes on him, and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing. Not blank, but still, the way water goes still over depth. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They are trying to use me." "They are trying to use the situation," he said. "You are not a pawn to them. You are simply an element they believe they can leverage." "That is what it means to be used," she said. "You become an element." She paused. "How serious is the threat to the treaty? If the Hollenbrook faction can successfully argue that the marriage is unstable, they have grounds under the treaty framework to request a renegotiation window. That window would take months. During those months, the protections on the southern supply routes are in technical review, which means the Hollenbrook clan can legally challenge the access agreements, which means 40,000 people's food security is at risk, while diplomats argue." He paused. "So, serious." She looked at him for a long time. "You are asking me to walk into a room full of people," she said slowly, "most of whom will know who I am and what I mean to the situation, and to do it publicly, not as a servant, not as a person who is part of the background." She paused. "You are asking me to stand in a room and be seen." "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I am asking. Serene wants this. Serene suggested it." "Those are not the same thing," she said. He paused. "No, they are not. She suggested it because she believes it will work. She also said, clearly, that you do not have to." Alara set her tea down on the low table. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "She wants to meet me." "Yes," she asked. "I told her you might find it alarming. She said she thought you would come anyway." Something passed across Alara's face. "She said that?" "Yes." She was quiet. He waited. He had become, over the past weeks, better at waiting around her, understanding that her silences were not empty, but working, that interrupting them was like knocking over a structure before it had set. "My whole life," she said, finally, "people have been using my existence to argue that I am insufficient. Pack councils with their formal documents. Garrett, reading from a paper in a doorway. 6 years of being in a room, and being told the room was better without me." She stopped. "And now someone wants me to walk into the most formal room in the city to prove that I exist." He looked at her. "The difference," she said, more to herself than to him, "is whether I go in as myself or as an argument." "You would go as yourself," he said. "The argument would be carried by the fact that you are there. You would not have to make it." She looked at him for a long moment. "If I do this," she said, "it is not for the treaty. Not entirely." She paused. I need you to understand that. I am not a diplomatic gesture. I am not attending a reception because it serves a political purpose. I know, he said. If I go, it is because I am choosing to. For myself. Because I have spent my entire life being small and invisible and arranged out of the way, and I am finished with it. She stopped. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said, and I want you to know that whether you go or not, that is not something I will hold against you in either direction. You do not owe this situation your courage. She looked at him, and for the first time in all their meetings, her expression did what it had not done before. Not breaking, not softening in the way of someone letting their guard down, but something warmer, something that was not the product of decision-making, but of a moment, being what it actually was. She said, "Tell Serene I will meet her." He said, "I will." The meeting between Serene and Alara happened 2 days later, in the library, in the late morning, when the light through the tall windows was good. Kaidan was not present. This was deliberate on both women's parts, and communicated without discussion. Serene was already there when Oliver brought Alara up, and she stood when Alara came in, and she said, "Thank you for coming," in the same simple tone she used for most things. Direct, without ceremony, without the hovering warmth that people sometimes produce when they are trying to make a person feel welcome, because they feel they should, rather than because they mean it. Alara said, "I did not know whether to bring anything." "No," Serene said. "Please sit." They sat across from each other, and there was a brief silence that was not the silence of hostility or difficulty, but of two people, measuring the distance between themselves and deciding how much of it to cross. Then Serene said, "I want to say this directly. I do not blame you for anything." Alara looked at her. "I mean that fully," Serene said. "What happened between you and Kaidan? Neither of you chose it. Neither of you arranged it. It is simply true, and the truth of it is not your responsibility." She paused. "I chose this arrangement with clear eyes. I knew what it was. I have no standing to hold its reality against anyone." Alara said, "You have more standing than you are claiming." Serene looked at her, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Recognition, perhaps. "Fair," she said. "You are right. It is not uncomplicated for me. But complicated and unfair are different things, and I refuse to treat this as unfair when it is simply complicated." A pause. "He speaks well of you," Alara said. "He said you were someone who wanted full information, and was capable of handling it." Serene looked mildly amused. "That is a generous summary of what is probably a more ambivalent quality." "Most of the useful ones are," Alara said. Serene looked at her for a moment, and then she said something that Alara had not expected. "I am glad you are someone who does not disappear." Alara did not respond immediately. "I mean this seriously," Serene said. "There are many ways a person in your position might have chosen to handle this. You could have left, you could have been hidden, you could have been made into something manageable." She paused. "You appear to have refused all of those options. I was very tired of them," Alara said. "Yes," Serene said. "I imagine you were." They sat together in the library for 40 minutes more, and they talked, and not all of it was comfortable, and some of it was genuinely difficult, and the particular difficulty of two people sitting with a truth they did not ask for, and choosing to be honest with each other anyway, filled the room in a way that was better than the alternative. When Alara stood to leave, Serene said, "The reception. I want you to know something before you go." Alara waited. "Whatever happens at that reception, whatever the factions do or do not do, whatever the public outcome is, your being there is not about the treaty." She paused. "It is about the fact that someone in this kingdom looked at you and saw what was there, and you deserve to exist in that without apology." Another pause. "I am not saying this as the queen. I am saying it as a woman who, in a different way, has also spent a significant portion of her life managing how much space she is permitted to take up." Alara looked at her. "I will be there," Alara said. She meant it the same way she had meant it when she wrote it in the note to Kaidan. Not easily, not simply, but clearly. She went. Downstairs, in the lower service corridor, Nell was at her workstation when Alara returned, and she looked up, and she could read in Alara's face that whatever had happened upstairs had not broken her. "All right?" Nell said. "Yes," Alara said. She sat down at her station, picked up her scissors, and paused. Then she said, "It is still complicated." "Yes," Nell said. "But it is real," Ilara said. "All of it. It is actually real." "That is rarer than you would think," Nell said. Ilara picked up her work. Outside, the last of the autumn was giving way. The city of Ashvale was cold and clear and sharp at the edges in the way that late autumn has, and the palace on the hill above it stood in the pale light with all of its complications and all of its people quietly moving through them, and the reception was 6 days away. The night before the reception, Ilara could not sleep. This was not unusual for her. She had never been a person who slept easily before anything significant, and what was happening tomorrow was about as significant as anything that had ever happened to her. She lay in her room at Mrs. Fallon's house, and looked at the ceiling, and listened to the quiet of the street outside, and thought about everything that was about to change, which was, depending on how you counted, either a great deal, or simply the next morning. She had borrowed a dress from Nell, who was approximately her size, and who had, without a great deal of ceremony, produced from a trunk beneath her bed, a dark gray-green dress, made of good fabric, that had been worn once to a family celebration, and then put away. "It is the right kind of thing," Nell had said, holding it up against Ilara critically. "Not too formal, not too plain. You do not want to look like you tried too hard, and you do not want to look like you did not try at all." Ilara had tried it on. It fit well enough. The color suited her, which she knew the way. She knew the quality of a good seam, practically, without sentiment. She had taken it home, and hung it on the back of her door, and was now lying in the dark looking at the ceiling, with it hanging there in her peripheral vision, like a fact she could not stop being aware of. She thought about the council chamber conversation that Caden had described to her, the one where 6 of his senior advisors had gathered after the first rumors reached the formal level, and a series of very careful, very professional questions had been asked about the king's household and its stability. She had not been in that room. She only knew what he had told her, but she could reconstruct it clearly, because she had spent her life being discussed in rooms she was not in. The packed council sessions, the garret conversation in the doorway, the formal removal notice read from a folded paper, in a voice that carried no emotion, because her emotional response was not a consideration. In those rooms she had been a category, a type, a failure to integrate, a failure to bond, an element that did not function as required. In the council chamber, she had been a complication, a diplomatic concern, an uncertainty in a treaty framework. She thought about Serene saying, "Your being there is not about the treaty. It is about the fact that someone in this kingdom looked at you and saw what was there." She thought about what it would feel like to walk into a room as herself, not as a problem being managed, or a detail being quietly arranged, or a person who takes up the smallest possible amount of space so as not to disturb whatever the room already contains. She had been small for so long. The smallness had begun as a survival strategy. Stay quiet, do not demand, be easy to overlook and therefore difficult to remove. But at some point, the way most things do when they are held for long enough, it had become less a strategy and more a shape, the shape of her. The way she moved through rooms and spoke in meetings and even sat at workroom tables, slightly condensed, slightly tucked, slightly less than full. She thought about the reception tomorrow and the Hollenbrook delegation who would be watching with the specific attention of people who have come looking for information. She thought about what they expected to see, a palace situation that was managed and smoothed over, a seamstress who was conveniently invisible, a marriage that presented one face to the public and carried a different reality within its walls. She thought, "They have never met me." And she thought, more accurately, no one has, not fully. She lay in the dark until 2 in the morning, and then she got up, because lying down was not producing sleep, and she sat at the small table, and did what she always did, when she needed to think clearly. She picked up something to work with her hands. She had a small repair job she had brought home from the workroom, a piece of embroidered edge trim that had a small unraveling section. She sat at the table in the lamplight and repaired it with the slow, deliberate precision of someone doing a thing that does not require thought and therefore makes room for thought. By the time she finished, she had arrived at a kind of clarity that was not the same as feeling all right. She did not feel all right, exactly. She felt the way a person feels standing at the top of something high before making a jump they have decided to make. Present, a little afraid, and also done deliberating. She went back to bed and slept 3 hours and woke at 6, with the particular sharpness of very early mornings after too little sleep. She got up, washed her face, made tea on Mrs. Fallon's stove in the quiet kitchen, sat with it by the window, and watched the city come on. The state reception was held in the formal reception hall on the second floor of the palace, a large, high-ceilinged room that was a step down in scale from the Great Hall, but considerably more intimate, with windows along the south wall and a long table of refreshments along the east, and a floor space designed for the formal circulation of 100 people or so. It was, in state reception terms, a moderate event, significant enough to require full dress and formal attendance, small enough that every person in the room was there with a specific purpose. The Hollenbrook delegation arrived punctually, which was itself a statement. When delegations arrive punctually, they are in control enough not to need the performance of delay. There were 4 of them, their chief representative, a compact and shrewd woman named Lady Prentice, who had been managing her clan's diplomacy for 15 years, and 3 advisors, whose function was primarily to observe and remember. Alara arrived with Nell. This was not planned, exactly. She had mentioned to Nell that morning that she was going to the reception, and Nell had said, without any particular fanfare, "I will come with you to the door." And then she had appeared at Mrs. Fallon's house at the appointed time in her second-best clothes, and she had walked with Alara through the city, and through the palace gates, and through the east entrance, and up to the second floor, and at the door of the reception hall she had said, "I will be in the corridor," and Alara had said, "Thank you," and gone in. The room was already about half full when she entered. She stood at the edge of it for a moment and let herself see it. The people, the lights, the arrangement of status and rank that is always present in any formal gathering whether anyone acknowledges it or not. She could feel the quiet that moved across the nearest portion of the room when she entered, the brief reorientation of attention that told her people knew who she was, or knew enough. She held herself upright. Not stiffly. She was not performing dignity, which collapses under pressure anyway. She was simply not folding. She was standing at her full height in a borrowed gray-green dress, and she was looking at the room, and she was there. Serene found her within 3 minutes, which was faster than Alara had expected, and which she appreciated, because standing at the edge of a formal room waiting to be seen can acquire a quality of endurance very quickly. Serene crossed the floor without particular ceremony, which itself was a statement, the new Queen of Ashvale moving directly and deliberately toward someone who was not on the formal guest list. "You came," Serene said, when she reached her. "I said I would," Alara said. Serene looked at her steadily. "How are you?" "I have been better in the past," Alara said, "and significantly worse." The smallest smile crossed Serene's face. That is a fair assessment of the middle. She turned slightly, to stand beside Alara rather than across from her, which positioned them both facing the room. It was a social move of considerable precision. They were now standing together, which was visible to everyone in the room, and anyone who wanted to read the situation was invited to read it clearly. Do not feel obligated to speak to anyone you do not choose to speak to. "I know," Alara said, "and if Lady Prentice approaches you, she will. You do not need to say anything beyond what you find comfortable." "I will not say less than the truth," Alara said, "and I will not say more than I mean." "That," Serene said quietly, "is exactly right." Caden found them together, which was its own kind of statement, and he stood with both of them for a period of the reception that was long enough to be deliberate and public, and short enough not to feel like a declaration. He spoke to Alara directly in Serene's presence, and Serene responded to things Alara said, and the 3 of them occupied a space together in the formal room that was, if you were watching, entirely clear in what it communicated. They were not performing unity. They were simply not hiding the reality, which is a different thing, and considerably more durable. Lady Prentice observed this for approximately 20 minutes before she made her approach. She came directly to Alara, passing Caden and Serene, and choosing the one member of this group who was the least formally protected, which was a tactic, and not a subtle one. She introduced herself with precision, and looked at Alara with the practiced assessment of someone who has evaluated hundreds of situations, and is very good at it. "I have heard a great deal about you this week," Lady Prentice said. "I imagine you have heard some things that are accurate and some that are not," Alara said. Lady Prentice looked at her. "And which are which?" "The accurate ones," Alara said. are the ones I have already confirmed by being here. She paused. The inaccurate ones are the ones that involve any version of this situation being unstable or uncertain. Lady Prentice was quiet for a moment. She was very good at reading people, and what she was reading in Elara was giving her, it appeared, information that did not entirely match the framework she had arrived with. Elara was not nervous. She was not performing composure, which would have been visible to a woman like Lady Prentice from across the room. She was simply present, and steady, and entirely uninterested in being managed. The treaty, Lady Prentice said, carefully, stands on the alliance structure. The treaty stands on its legal framework, Elara said, which is held by Lady Serene and the King and the respective councils, all of whom are present this evening, and none of whom have given you any reason to believe otherwise. She paused. What you have been given is a fragment of a private situation that has been misrepresented to you as a political fracture. It is not one. Lady Prentice looked at her for a long moment. You are very direct, she said. Yes, Elara said. I have found it saves time. There was another pause. Then Lady Prentice said, I hope you will forgive the inquiry. There is nothing to forgive, Elara said. You were given information that suggested there might be an opportunity. I understand the impulse to examine it. There is not one. Lady Prentice held her gaze for a moment more. Then she inclined her head very slightly, a small, precise acknowledgement, and moved on to speak with Elder Dorian. Elara stood in the room after she left and breathed. She was still there. She had not collapsed. The conversation had not unraveled her. She had said what was true, in her own words, at her own pace, and it had landed. From across the room, Rion caught her eye briefly. He had been watching the Prentice conversation, with the attention of a man who has staked his professional analysis on its outcome. He looked, for a man of few expressions, mildly impressed. He looked away. Caden was beside her a moment later, not in a way that drew attention, but present. All right? He said. Yes, she said. And this time it was not the automatic yes of someone deflecting. It was specific. She looked at him. I told her the truth. I heard, he said. She was not wrong to check, Elara said. The situation is unusual. It would look uncertain from the outside. It looks less uncertain than she expected, Caden said. Because it is less uncertain than she expected, Elara said. That is what happens when the people in a situation stop pretending it is something it is not. He looked at her. We are not simple, she said. We are not resolved. The complications are real. But we are honest about them. And that is different from unstable. She paused. That is what she saw. That is what anyone watching tonight sees. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You came as yourself. Yes, she said. That was the point. The reception continued for 2 hours more. Elara spoke to several people, some who approached her with curiosity, and some who approached her with caution, and one older council member, who had served under Caden's father, and who said to her, in a direct and genuine way, that he was glad she was here. She did not know why he was specifically glad. She said thank you, and meant it. When the formal portion ended, and the room began to thin, Nell appeared at the door of the hall, as promised, in the corridor. Elara went out to her. Well? Nell said. Elara stood in the corridor, and thought about the honest answer. I was there, she said, as myself, the whole time. Nell looked at her. Yes, she said, I can see that. They walked home together through the night city. The streets were cold and quiet, and the lamps made pools of gold on the stone, and somewhere above them, the palace sat on its hill, with its formal windows lit, and its complicated residents doing whatever they did after the formal thing was over. Caden sat with Serene in the small sitting room adjacent to the reception hall afterward, both of them with tea. The evening wound down to something quieter. Serene said, She did well. She did, he said. Lady Prentice left without the angle she came looking for, Serene said. Yes. A quiet moment. We are going to need to keep talking, Serene said, the three of us, about what comes next. I know, Caden said. It is not going to be simple. No, he said. It is not going to be simple. Serene looked at her tea. But it can be honest, she said. And in my experience, honest is a better foundation than simple. She paused. Honest things tend to hold. He thought about a woman in a storage corridor during a lockdown, sitting with her bag held against her chest and her face turned toward the wall. He thought about the same woman walking into a formal reception room in a borrowed dress and standing at her full height and looking at the room as though she had every right to be there. Because she did, and she had finally decided to know it. He thought about what it cost to be that honest, for that long, in that particular life. He thought, I will not waste what it cost her. Yes, he said to Serene. Honest things tend to hold. The city of Ashvale settled around them as the night deepened. The treaty held its shape. The borders were quieter than they had been in 5 years. In the palace, 3 people with a complicated reality had chosen, each in their own way and for their own reasons, to deal with it honestly rather than conveniently. In a rented room 3 streets from the palace wall, Alara Vane took off the borrowed gray-green dress and hung it carefully on its hook and sat down on the edge of her bed. She thought about tomorrow, not with dread, with something more like interest, the kind of interest that belongs to a person who has, for the first time in memory, arrived at a morning that they did not have to brace for. The situation was still complicated. She was still a woman without a pack, living in a rented room, working a contract that would eventually end. She was still at the center of something that had no clean resolution. She was still the person who was going to have to keep choosing, day after day, to stand at her full height in rooms that were not designed for her. But she had done it tonight. She had gone into the room, and she had been herself, and the room had not broken her. She thought, this is not the end, but it is the beginning of something that I am choosing, all of it, for myself. She lay down and turned off the lamp. Below her window, Mrs. Fallon's cat crossed the street without hurry, stopped to consider something invisible on the cobblestones, then moved on. The last lamp on the block flickered once and held. Morning was a few hours away. She was not afraid of it.